You're watching BBC News. It's 2 o'clock. I'm Ben Brown reporting live from Westminster. Our latest headlines: Boris Johnson is elected as the new Conservative Party leader and will become the next UK Prime Minister.
Jeremy Hunt, 46,656. Boris Johnson, 92,153.
He beat Jeremy Hunt in a poll of Tory party members, winning almost two-thirds of the vote.
Deliver Brexit, unite the country and defeat Jeremy Corbyn. And that is what we're going to do.
I think he will be a great Prime Minister. He's got optimism, enthusiasm, he puts a smile on people's face, and he has total, unshakable confidence.
Well, Mr Johnson promised to deliver Brexit by October the 31st. The new EU Commission President says she's looking forward to working with him in what she calls the challenging times ahead. And President Trump has already congratulated Boris Johnson, saying he will be great.
Headline two, the UK allegedly prepares for a heatwave as temperatures climb well above 30 degrees this week.
Hello, very good afternoon to you from Westminster. So now we know, and in the end there was no great surprise. Boris Johnson was always favourite to win, and now he has been voted in as the new Conservative Party leader. He'll officially take office as Prime Minister tomorrow after meeting with the Queen at Buckingham Palace. Well, Boris Johnson gained around double the votes that Jeremy Hunt did from Conservative Party members. And in his victory speech, Mr Johnson promised to unite the country and to deliver Brexit by the deadline of the 31st of October. But he's already seen some ministerial resignations, and there could be more, as several cabinet ministers have already said they can't support his do-or-die promise to leave the EU by the end of October. Our political correspondent Ian Watson has our first report.
He walked in first but finished second. Jeremy Hunt was decisively defeated by Boris Johnson. For many, the former Foreign Secretary was the face of Brexit, the mop-topped figurehead of Vote Leave. And that probably appealed to the two-thirds of Conservative members who gave them their support. He said he'd take Britain out of the EU by the end of October, and his acceptance speech was a cocktail of optimism and humour with only the slightest dash of detail.
And we know the mantra of the campaign that has just gone by. In case you've forgotten it, you probably have. It's always a couple of, it is deliver Brexit, unite the country and defeat Jeremy Corbyn. And that is what we're going to do. And I know some waggles already pointed out that deliver, unite and defeat was not the perfect acronym for an election campaign, since unfortunately it spells dud. But they forgot the final E, my friends. E for energise.
He seems to have already united his family, though some have very different views on Brexit. But he romped through some of his other policy ambitions too.
And we are once again going to believe in ourselves and what we can achieve. And like some slumbering giant, we are going to rise and ping off the guy ropes of self-doubt and negativity with better education, better infrastructure, more police, fantastic full fibre broadband sprouting in every household.
Theresa May promised to support Boris Johnson from the backbenches, but not everyone in the Conservative Party is going to be so generous. The announcement of the new Conservative leader was made here, but the real challenges begin tomorrow when he moves just round the corner into Downing Street. Boris Johnson has said that he'll take us off the hamster wheel of doom, as he calls it, and get Britain out of the European Union by the end of October. If he doesn't do that, his time in Downing Street may be limited. If he does do that, but without a deal, he'll be facing not just the opposition, but the unofficial opposition, senior members of Theresa May's government who are prepared to rebel against him. Another former Foreign Secretary believes Boris Johnson could face some significant hurdles here in Parliament.
There are at least, probably in my estimation, up to 50 Tory MPs who will not support no deal. And as long as he seems to be talking in that sort of language, he will lose every vote in the House of Commons.
This is one minister who won't serve under Boris Johnson. David Gauke's colleagues who oppose no deal have been dubbed the Gawkward Squad.
There is a clear majority in the House of Commons that doesn't want to leave the EU without a deal. I think that will become very clear in the autumn. That'll be underlined in the autumn. I think there may well be ways in which Parliament finds an ability to make it clear what it thinks, and that is binding upon the new Prime Minister.
And the Education Minister, Anne Milton, resigned today. She was concerned that Britain could leave the EU with no deal.
I wish the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, well in his negotiations with the EU, but I have always had grave concerns about leaving the EU without a deal in place.
But one prominent Boris Johnson supporter was rather looking down on those who choose to criticise him.
There is no scope now for self-indulgence and individual MPs just expressing their own views. For the Conservative Party to deliver for our country, we have to unite, we have to come together.
How are you feeling, Mr Hunt?
Boris Johnson's opponent admitted that he was disappointed and called for unity. And this was his diagnosis for his failure to win.
This was always going to be uphill for us because I was someone who voted Remain. We have a Prime Minister who voted Remain, and I think lots of Conservative Party members felt that this was a moment when you just had to have someone who voted for Brexit in the referendum. And that was, in retrospect, that was a hurdle we were never able to overcome.
The future's uncertain for Larry the Downing Street cat, and indeed for the country. The new Prime Minister has a wafer-thin majority, even with Northern Ireland's DUP on side. Boris Johnson moves in here tomorrow. It is not clear how long his tenure will last. Ian Watson, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's go live to our chief political correspondent, Vicki Young, who's at Conservative Party headquarters. And Vicki, Mr Johnson is there now.
That's right, he has just arrived, greeted by the party chairman, Brandon Lewis. We're told he's going to spend at least a couple of hours here. He'll obviously be speaking to staff and then presumably working on the reshuffle, working on who is going to be in his top team. And I think that he's had quite a lot of time to think about this at the weekend. Certainly most of his team were pretty confident he was going to win today, so some thought will have gone into that, but it's going to be very interesting to see who he puts in key positions, the top jobs of course, not least what's going to happen to Jeremy Hunt, who is currently the Foreign Secretary. Would he be moved? Will he stay in the post? Who will be his Chancellor? Lots of speculation. Sajid Javid could take that role. How many women will he put in senior positions? Will it be a more diverse team than we've had in the past? So all of those questions for Boris Johnson to deal with, not least because, of course, that deadline, leaving the EU, the end of October, October the 31st, there just isn't much time if he wants to renegotiate a deal, try to get some kind of new deal, which most people think will look very much like the deal that Theresa May has already got, but he will want to get changes to that. That's his aim. And if not, he said that do or die, he will leave the EU without a deal at the end of October. And that is where the controversy would really kick in, because there are so many in the Tory party in Parliament who just won't accept that as government policy. That's why some have already said they're going to resign, people like the Chancellor Philip Hammond and others who say they can't serve under Boris Johnson for that reason. So an awful lot in his in-tray. He spoke today about other issues. I think he wants to try and not just talk about Brexit. It's going to be very hard to get away from that issue, but he has talked today about education, about better funding for education, about having more police, broadband, infrastructure projects, all of those things, which he also wants to try and get on the front foot. But it is that issue of Brexit that will undoubtedly dominate for the next few months.
All right, Vicki, thank you very much indeed, Vicki Young. And let's talk now to the political commentator, Ian Dale. And Ian, you chaired, I think, 10 of the hustings in this leadership contest. Did the result go roughly as you were expecting?
Roughly. I thought it might be a bit tighter, actually, because a lot of the undecideds at the hustings, I think, actually gravitated towards Jeremy Hunt. But this is an emphatic victory for Boris Johnson. No one can say that 2/3 of the vote is anything but emphatic.
What did you think of his campaign? It started off not too well with all the stories about the row, and you questioned him about that in one of your hustings, but did he manage to escape the banana skins in the end?
Well, he did, because a week after that, nobody was talking about it, which was interesting to say the least. I think, look, his campaign managed to say their strategy was completely vindicated. They kept him wrapped up in cotton wool for the parliamentary stages. He hardly did any interviews. I did hour-long interviews with 11 of the candidates. He was the only one that didn't do an interview. And they will say, well, we won, so that vindicates the strategy. I think you're going to see a very different Boris Johnson now. I think you're going to see him out and about far more than any other recent Prime Minister. I think he'll be a bit like Tony Blair, sort of being everywhere. And I don't think he'll sort of hunker down in the Downing Street bunker like Gordon Brown did or Theresa May has done.
And very different also in terms of what he said, because he kept saying the rhetoric was pretty strong, do or die, we are getting out of the EU by October the 31st. Does he really mean that?
He does. I think he does mean it, and he's going to be judged on it. So in 100 days' time, and that's all that's really left, the electorate will judge him, Conservative Party members will judge him, and Conservative MPs will judge him. The ERG group are going to judge him, and if they decide that he's flaked away on Brexit in any way or gone soft on it, believe me, retribution will be very swift.
But does part of him want a deal, and can he get a deal? Can he succeed in a deal where Theresa May fails?
I know very few people in the Conservative Party. I mean, I can only really think of John Redwood, who said, I don't want a deal. Most people think, in an ideal world, we would leave with a deal. But as Jeremy Hunt has said throughout the contest, if a deal looks impossible by the end of September, then there is only one way to go. Now the question then is Parliament going to frustrate that? And if it is, we can then look forward to a general election at the end of October.
But a lot of people are saying we don't really know what Boris Johnson thinks. We know what we've heard from him, we've heard the rhetoric, but him as Prime Minister in number 10 Downing Street could be quite a different proposition.
Well, we haven't heard detailed plans from either of them in this campaign. In a sense, on Brexit, I wouldn't expect to, because the last thing that Boris Johnson was going to do was publish a 100-page paper on his negotiating strategy. That would have been a lunatic thing to do. That's where Theresa May fell. She did give away far too much of the so-called strategy, even though it's kind to call it a strategy. So I hope there is a document somewhere in his bottom drawer that he is going to take out, and that he knows exactly what he's going to do, because there isn't much time to do it. Michel Barnier constantly tells us the clock is ticking. Well, the clock has ticked almost, and he's only got 3 months to do this.
But even if he wants to, could he get no deal through Parliament, through this place, where we hear Philip Hammond and others are going to be the new rebels on the back benches who are going to be fighting him, stopping him?
Yeah, and I think the way these people have behaved, I mean, they always criticise the ERG for their disloyalty. Well, they're copying ERG tactics by doing this, resigning before they had to. We saw it with Alan Duncan yesterday. I mean, David Gauke today, who is one of the nicest people in politics, to actually announce that you've resigned just as Boris Johnson gets up on his feet, I thought that was an absolute disgrace. And it is going
doesn't that just show how disunited the party is?
Yes, it does. And I'm afraid the party is as disunited as the country. And in a sense, the Conservative Party reflects the mood of the country. Everyone wants everyone to come together, but no one can quite see a way of that happening.
But there could be as many as 50 Tory MPs who oppose no deal. So I ask you again, can you get it through Parliament?
Well, no deal is the default. Legally, we do leave the EU on October the 31st. And the other thing that nobody's mentioning is that Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, could insist that we leave on October the 31st. I mean, they're saying, oh, well, we might extend it. Well, I'm not sure that every single European country will want to extend it this time. So he could actually rely on the French to do his dirty work for him. Wouldn't that be an irony?
And we've talked about the disunity of the party. Does Mr Johnson now try to restore unity with his cabinet choices? Is he going to pick Remainers for his cabinet as well as Brexiteers?
I think that's going to be very interesting to see what he does. With the 2/3 of the vote, I think he's got an almost free hand. The key to this will be to watch what happens to Jeremy Hunt, and I imagine that's the first conversation. You would think that with the conflict with Iran at the moment, Jeremy Hunt would be guaranteed to stay where he is. He did a good campaign. OK, he only got 33% of the vote, but I think most people would say he deserves to stay as Foreign Secretary. There is a thought that he could be actually promoted to Chancellor. Did you know he was an entrepreneur? I mean, I don't know if you picked that up over the course of the campaign. But I mean, I think that would be an interesting move. He's got some radical thoughts on economic policy. But I don't think he's going to accept anything else. He has said he will accept a job under Boris, but I can't really imagine him going back to sort of what would be deemed as a second-rank cabinet role.
Going to be fascinating to see. Ian Dale, for the moment, thank you very much indeed for your analysis. Well, let's get some context now From Northern Ireland, because as we've been hearing, the biggest challenge facing the new Prime Minister is, of course, Brexit, and in particular trying to avoid that hard Irish border. And Emma Vardy is at Stormont for us. Emma, the issue of the backstop so critical. What is the reaction there to the news that Boris Johnson has, as expected, become Tory party leader and will become Prime Minister tomorrow?
Well, of course, Boris Johnson becoming the new Prime Minister will have huge implications for Northern Ireland. As you say, that backstop had been negotiated by Theresa May, but she couldn't get it through Parliament, those arrangements to avoid checks on the Irish border. It was something people agonised and argued over here for months and months. But now, with Boris Johnson taking the helm, it means Brexit going off in a whole new direction. Just to remind people, the reason it is so difficult is because you are taking one part of this island, Northern Ireland, out of the EU club, putting it in a different set of trading arrangements, and yet still trying to keep that seamless trade between businesses north and south of the Irish border and avoiding any checks. Well, Boris Johnson wants to go back to the EU, ditch the backstop and say, let's sort this out in a free trading agreement. The EU's repeatedly said no to that, which leaves a lot of people here fearing we are heading for a no-deal Brexit. There has been reaction coming in today so far. A very quick congratulations from the DUP, who have been Theresa May's allies in government, propping up the administration because she needs their votes because of having such a teeny tiny majority in Parliament. So quick congratulations from the DUP, saying they're looking forward to working with Boris Johnson to secure the union, of course that fundamental principle that the DUP fights for. But just to remind people, that confidence and supply arrangement which Theresa May brokered with the Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland, well, that is going to be up for renegotiation. We'll have to wait and see what sort of price perhaps the DUP ask for and what sort of negotiations they broker with Boris Johnson, because he will need their votes to get anything through Parliament. But from Irish nationalist parties here, well, broadly speaking, the big divide on Brexit here in Northern Ireland is that nationalist politicians and parties have been very, very opposed to Brexit in any form, and particularly opposed to a no-deal Brexit, which they fear could cause the most disruption here on the island of Ireland. And very quickly, the leader of the SDLP was very negative towards the idea of Boris Johnson becoming PM, saying that he's going to push the administration towards a catastrophic cliff edge. So mixed reactions here with this new Boris Johnson era ahead.
Emma, thank you very much. Emma Vardy there, our Ireland correspondent. Well, meanwhile, in Scotland, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has today warned Boris Johnson that she has profound concerns about him getting the keys to number 10 and has called for another Scottish independence referendum. Let's talk to Lorna Gordon, who's in Glasgow. Lorna, what is the reaction there in Scotland to the news of Mr Johnson winning the leadership?
Very muted so far. Ruth Davison, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, has congratulated him, of course, but as you say, from Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, very different comments. She did the polite congratulations, but it was very brief. The rest of her comments were warnings and questions, she said, that she had about his character. She described Boris Johnson as a charlatan who had no political principles beyond advancing his own interests, and she urged him to rule out a no-deal Brexit. Ms Sturgeon warned him that he should be in no doubt about the strength with which she and others will oppose leaving the EU without a deal. You remember, of course, that a majority of people here in Scotland voted to remain as part of the European Union in that referendum way back 3 years ago or so. And recent polling suggests that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, up to 60% of people here in Scotland would support independence. Ms Sturgeon said that Mr Johnson would be unable to resist the pressure for a new referendum on Scottish independence, because, of course, remember that the power to have a referendum on Scottish independence lies with the Westminster government. Boris Johnson didn't mention Scotland in those brief comments he made this morning, but he will be alert to the dangers and challenges he faces with this separate second union. He has talked about adding the title Minister for the Union to that of Prime Minister, setting up a union unit which would look at all policies through the prism of the devolved nations. He's also said he will protect the Barnett formula, which is the funding formula for the nations as well. But there are difficult times ahead for Boris Johnson when it comes with the relationship with Scotland. Perhaps a sense of that is the fact that the very first protests that we can see against Boris Johnson's premiership is going to happen before he even officially takes on the role, and that will be later on this afternoon here in Glasgow.
Lorna, thank you. And what about the view from Wales, where there is a by-election coming up, and beyond a single hustings that was held in Cardiff, issues relating to Wales, it has to be said, barely featured in the Conservative Party leadership contest. Well, Sian Lloyd is in Cardiff with the latest. Sian.
Yes, the first electoral test for the new Prime Minister is looming with that Brecon and Radnorshire by-election in a few days' time. But back to today and the here and now and the response that there has been to the fact that Boris Johnson is the new leader of the Conservatives. Well, from the leader of the Welsh Conservatives, Paul Davies, he supported him. He said that he thinks that he'll do a great job. We need a charismatic, uplifting, positive leadership, and Boris will deliver that, he said. I spoke to the Secretary of State for Wales, Alan Cairns, and he felt that the scale of Mr Johnson's victory reflected the response that he was seeing on the ground. And he feels that Boris Johnson will bring unification from within communities. He says he has a sense of purpose that is optimistic about post-Brexit Britain. Well, the position of the Welsh Government towards the Conservative leadership contest has always centred on Brexit. And what ministers here in Cardiff Bay were saying was that they felt that whoever did take the hot seat in number 10 should rule out a no-deal Brexit, because they believe that will be catastrophic for the Welsh economy in terms of exports, tariffs on Welsh lamb and beef, and also they believe that it will lead to fewer jobs here. Now, we know that Boris Johnson has refused to rule that out, but in terms of the response that has come from the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, he has said that he is looking forward to meeting him, and one would imagine that during that meeting Mark Drakeford would want to talk about something that came up in the hustings in Cardiff, where Boris Johnson did feel, he suggested that London ministers might have some say in how the cash that replaces the EU structural funds would be spent here in Wales.
OK, Sian, thank you very much indeed. Sian Lloyd reporting there from Cardiff. And with me here now, live at Westminster, I've got the Conservative MP and member of the European Research Group, the Brexiteer group in Parliament, Andrea Jenkins. Thank you very much for being with us. So Boris Johnson is the party leader. You have a Brexiteer at the helm. Now, the question is, will he pursue what he said he would in the campaign? Brexit by October the 31st, come what may, do or die. Do you believe him?
Yes, I've always said, straight after the referendum, only a Brexiteer can deliver Brexit. He was on the Leave campaign and he will deliver. The energy in that room today was amazing. You know, if we'd have had that positivity and can-do attitude 3 years ago, we'd be in a damn sight better place now.
Is he a true Brexiteer? Because, of course, before the referendum, he wrote those 2 articles, didn't he, for the Telegraph? Yeah. One supporting Remain and one supporting Leave, and he chose to go with Leave in the end. But yes. Do you think wholeheartedly he is a pure Brexiteer?
Well, he was on the Leave campaign and he helped us win the referendum, so I'm glad he's about to go into number 10.
What about the possibilities of a deal? I mean, a lot of people focus on the possibilities of a no deal, yes. but is he a leader who could get a deal, a different kind of deal from Theresa May?
I believe he is. I mean, I've been on the Brexit committee since its inception, over 3 years ago, and it has been a car crash. The way it's been approached, I mean, we offered the 39 billion before we even saw what the scope of a deal could look like. And so we've approached it wrongly. You wouldn't approach any negotiation in that way. So I think with Boris, he's going to, like do or die, really. He's going to say, this is what we want, and take it or leave it.
But the EU said they're not going to renegotiate the withdrawal agreement.
No, but
they haven't needed to before. We've had, unfortunately, a weak Prime Minister who has bent over backwards to, kowtow to the EU. With Boris, he is a Democrat who believes in delivering on the will of the people. And
so
Boris
you
will
think they're
deliver.
bluffing, do you, the EU, when
yes,
they say that?
Without a doubt. That's negotiations. They've got a stronger negotiating team than we've had previously. That's about to change. And let's not forget, even with Greece, they kept saying they wouldn't bail out Greece, they wouldn't bail out Greece. They did in the end. So once they see that it's a different approach, a whole new team, new cabinet behind him, then I think we'll hear them start talking.
You're in a strange position now in the ERG, aren't you? Because you were the rebels, effectively. You're now in power, aren't you? And the new rebels are people like Philip Hammond and the Remainers, who are refusing to see a no deal. But they've got power, haven't they? There could be 50 of them.
Well, I'd actually call them the rebels because, as ERG and Brexiteers, we was delivering on our manifesto commitment. They was always against the manifesto commitment which they stood on. So actually, we've been true to our party manifesto, not them.
But should Boris Johnson, when he forms his cabinet and his government, should he include people from all sides of the party, the Remain wing as well as the Brexiteer wing, or do you want him to be pure Brexiteer?
I want him to be anybody who signs up to his cabinet has got to do, like you said, the dude, really. They've got to, sign up to delivering Brexit, which include no deal going on WTO.
So they have to support no deal by.
Well, they've got to, yeah, if it comes to that. Also, delivering on the will of the people, uniting the country, and defeating Corbyn. And the last thing he said today, the EU, was energy. We need an energy cabinet. It's been stale. We've seen the impasse for too long in Parliament. We had a period of 5 or 6 weeks when there's no votes. It's been a zombie Parliament. We need this fresh approach now. Our country's crying out for it, and Boris is the man.
Andrea Jenkins, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, what about reaction from Brussels, where the European Union's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, has tweeted saying, quote, "We look forward to working constructively with the Prime Minister Boris Johnson when he takes office to facilitate the ratification of the withdrawal agreement and to achieve an orderly Brexit. We are ready also to rework the agreed declaration on a new partnership in line with European Council guidelines." And the European Commission's recently elected President, Ursula von der Leyen, has also offered her congratulations to Mr. Johnson.
First of all, congratulations to Boris Johnson to be nominated as Prime Minister. And I'm looking forward to have a good working relation with him. There are many different and difficult issues to tackle together. We have challenging times ahead of us. I think it is very important to build up a strong and a good working relation, because we have the duty to deliver something which is good for people in Europe and in the United Kingdom. So I'm looking forward to working with him. Thank you.
Well, EU leaders have been congratulating Mr. Johnson. Let's cross now to Brussels and to our Europe correspondent, Damien Grammaticus. What are people there saying, Damien? Obviously, they were expecting Mr. Johnson to get it, but now he has. What is the reaction?
Well, Ben, yes, as you say, expected, but I think a deep sort of sense now of concern about what will follow in the Brexit negotiations. So congratulations have come from all around Europe, from prime ministers and presidents, from President Macron. You heard Ursula von der Leyen there, who will be taking over from Jean-Claude Juncker here in November. But the same message. They all say that they congratulate Boris Johnson. They look forward to working with him constructively, but that withdrawal agreement on the table, as Jean-Claude Juncker's deputy here said today, has been agreed, and they do not envisage changing it. Now, that's the official position. Would they possibly shift? Well, in the past they did a little bit, or they did try to accommodate Theresa May. They changed the backstop around. They tried to give her extra reassurances. So there is precedent that the EU could, but I don't think we're seeing any sign here that they will fundamentally shift the position, which is that there has to be a solution to the issue of the border in Ireland. There has to be a solution to all those other sort of legal problems thrown up by the UK's exit. Otherwise, the EU will not budge.
OK, Damien, thank you very much indeed. Damien Grammaticus there for us in Brussels. OK, I'm going to hand you back to Rebecca, who's in the studio.
Ben, thank you. Much more from you in just a moment. But forecasters expect temperatures to rise throughout the week, with a heat wave predicted to bring temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius over the next few days.
On Thursday, it's even possible temperatures could beat the highest ever recorded in the UK, which was 38.5 Celsius, which was set in Faversham in Kent in August 2003. Well, joining us now is our reporter Caroline Davis from Regent's Park in central London. Caroline, it's hot. What should we all be doing?
It certainly is hot here, and everybody here has been enjoying a bit of their lunch break, sitting out in the sunshine and enjoying the heat. Just round the corner is London Zoo. We've been hearing that the lions are being kept cool there with blood ice lollies. So plenty of different measures in place to try and keep people enjoying this weather. Now, it's so hot in both England and also particularly in Wales that Public Health England have announced a heat health alert, level 3. That means that it's particularly relevant for people who are elderly, people who have children and young babies, also if you have a long-standing health condition as well. There is advice about what to do during the heat. It's firstly, of course, to stay hydrated. Now, that's not just about drinking water, it's also about the sort of food that you eat as well. So having strawberries, cucumbers, melons, things with a high water content, which will keep you hydrated as well. Particularly before you go to bed, think about having a cool shower or bath, and that will help you particularly during the night because it's very humid at the moment, which means it's difficult for your sweat to evaporate and cool you down as well. And of course, when you're out and about wearing cool, loose-fitting clothing and potentially a hat, or, as I'm doing, making sure you're staying out of the sun and in the shade as well. Now, there's been some suggestion about whether or not some of these events can be climate change related. Of course, heat waves happen in the summer and they can happen naturally as well. However, there has been in the last 10 years, according to the Met Office, a doubling in the number of warm spells in the UK. It's very difficult to attribute any form of heat wave to climate change in particular, but scientists do say that heat waves are more likely when we have these sorts of changes in our climate.
OK, Caroline Davis in central London, thanks for that for now. Let's catch up with the weather forecast now. We can cross the newsroom and talk to Darren Bett. Darren, we know it's hot.
It is certainly hot. Temperatures at the moment, Rebecca, are already 32 degrees Celsius. That's 90 Fahrenheit in both London and Jersey. The heat is building its way northwards into more eastern parts of Scotland. It's not hot everywhere, but the heat is mainly across England and Wales, widely 30 degrees plus, with a high of 35 expected this afternoon, later this afternoon in the southeast of England. It's also very humid, and the heat and humidity is going to trigger some thundery downpours. Those are going to arrive from the southwest this evening, head their way northwards. Very few places will be dry overnight. The rain could be torrential. It could be accompanied by some hail, some thunder, lightning, gusty winds as well. It's going to be very muggy overnight, particularly uncomfortable in the southeast. Those are the minimum temperatures where it may well stay dry. Any remaining rain in the morning, that's going to move away northwards, away from Scotland. We'll have one or two residual showers here and for Northern Ireland. Otherwise, sunshine returns. A slight change in the wind direction means the focus of the heat is more across the eastern side of England, highs of 33 or 34. But as we head into Thursday, as we get a southeasterly breeze bringing the heat in from the continent, we could break a record for July.
Welcome back to Westminster. Our headlines: Boris Johnson is elected as the new Conservative Party leader and will become Britain's next Prime Minister.
Jeremy Hunt, 46,656. Boris Johnson, 92,153.
Well, Mr. Johnson won almost 2/3 of the vote, ahead of Jeremy Hunt. Mr. Johnson promised to deliver Brexit by the end of October. The new EU Commission President says she's looking forward to working with him in what she calls the challenging times ahead. And President Trump has already congratulated Mr. Johnson, saying he will be great. Our other top story today: a heat wave hits the UK as temperatures are expected to climb to well over 30 degrees this week. So let's take you back to the main news today. Boris Johnson, as expected, being elected the new leader of the Conservative Party, pretty emphatically beating his rival Jeremy Hunt, taking 66% of the membership vote. 87% was the turnout. Well, in his acceptance speech, Mr Johnson paid tribute to his opponent, as well as to Theresa May, who he will replace, of course, as Prime Minister tomorrow. So, is Boris Johnson, the new Conservative Prime Minister, someone that the Liberal Democrats could possibly work with? Well, let's ask them in the shape of their new leader, Jo Swinson. Jo Swinson, first of all, congratulations on winning the leadership. Could you ever work with a Boris Johnson government?
Boris Johnson is a Brexiteer. His plan will be disastrous for our country, and indeed we see very little detail, even in his speech today, of how he intends to do it, beyond the bluster and bravado of just saying it's going to be fine. And frankly, Britain deserves better. This is a man who really only cares about one thing, and that's Boris Johnson.
What if he were to renegotiate a deal with Brussels, though? I mean, you don't even know what that might contain, so how could you know that you wouldn't support it?
Well, I think he's talking about delivering Brexit, which I do know will be disastrous for our country, and what we need is to be able to keep the benefits of EU membership. The Liberal Democrats have been absolutely clear. We are the strongest, most consistent party of Remain, and that's why we had such excellent results in the European elections and why thousands and thousands of people have been joining the Liberal Democrats in the last few weeks.
Mr Johnson styles himself as a kind of one-nation Conservative. Yes. Do you think he could be that, aside from issues around the European Union? Do you think in any way he can reunite a divided country?
Well, you say that. I don't think he styles himself as that very effectively. I mean, let's remember this is the man who's written about watermelon smiles and calling Muslim women letterboxes, who's written, misogynistic things about elite Olympic athletes, talking about them glistening like wet otters in a very derogatory way. This is not a man who is seriously trying to unite the country. In fact, this is not a man who is serious at all. And these are difficult times. We're effectively in a national state of crisis with Brexit. If you look around the world, from Iran to Hong Kong, these are times for somebody that will address these issues with seriousness, not somebody who's pretending to try and be a rather poor stand-up comic.
What do you think are the chances of this election of Boris Johnson as leader precipitating a general election maybe in the next few months? How do you see that?
I think it's certainly possible. At the moment, politics is very difficult to predict. Clearly, I'll be campaigning hard and working with people from lots of other parties for a people's vote, and I think that is still deliverable, and that, of course, is a way in which we would give people the chance to say whether they like the deal that is on offer or whether they would prefer to stay in the European Union, which is what the Liberal Democrats will be campaigning for. But it's also entirely possible that we could have a general election, and I would welcome that, because I think Boris Johnson is a disaster for our country, both domestically and indeed on the world stage, and therefore I welcome the opportunity to take him on in a general election.
And do you think that might be soon? Are you making preparations?
Of course.
Have you got the planning underway?
Of course we're making preparations, and we are going to be more ambitious than ever before, because right now in our politics there are millions of people who look at Boris Johnson having been elected Prime Minister with the Conservative Party going off to the right, look at Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party going off to the left, both of them Brexiteers, both of them not able to take on problematic issues within their own parties, whether it's Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. And people want something better, and they deserve something better. And as Liberal Democrats, I'm determined that we give them that positive alternative.
The Liberal Democrats, and the word Democrats, doesn't that suggest that you should obey, and I'm sure people will be saying this as they listen to you, that you should obey what the people said in that referendum 3 years ago?
Democracy didn't end on the 23rd of June 2016. And what we're looking at now is something which is so different to what was talked about then. Nobody was saying we'd be leaving without a deal. Do you remember we were told we were going to get the best deals, it was going to be the easiest deal in human history? What we're looking at now is very different to that. I don't believe that there is a majority in the country for any specific type of Brexit. And if that's the case, it would be hugely irresponsible to go down that path.
But there was a majority 3 years ago.
But not for a specific form of Brexit.
But there was a majority for leaving the European Union.
Yeah, I accept that there was. But then we heard Theresa May saying that what that meant was that Brexit meant Brexit. Well, 3 years on, the Brexiteers still can't even agree on what Brexit means. So we need to be able to have confidence that the public support the course of action that the government is taking. And I think the only way to gain that confidence is through having a people's vote on that Brexit deal with the option to stay in the EU.
And if they voted again to leave, would you then endorse leaving the European Union?
I'm not going to change my view on what I think is right for our country.
But would you support leaving the EU? It's a simple question.
Well, would I support it? Would I be, positive about it? I'm not going to change my fundamental beliefs.
Would you vote for it in Parliament?
No, because I was elected on a firm manifesto pledge to fight for Scotland's place in the UK and the UK's place in the European Union, and that's what Liberal Democrats are here to do. That is the mandate that we have. But
so even if the people spoke twice and said they wanted to leave twice, you would still oppose that?
I'm going to do what I was sent here to do, which is to stand up for the things that I believe in and stand up for the principles of working internationally with other countries to tackle the shared challenges that we face, whether that's the climate emergency or international terrorism. We need to be working with our closest neighbours to be able to protect our prosperity and our security. But if people have the choice, then at least we could have confidence that people actually wanted to go down that path. And at the moment, as I say, I think there is no reason to believe that any specific Brexit path, whether it's a no-deal Brexit or Theresa May's Brexit, actually commands the support of the country. And given that the government says it will be catastrophic for our economy, there will be significant hits to our economy, to jobs, to our public services, to our national security, how could we go down that path without knowing that that is what people want?
Jo Swinson, thank you very much indeed, new leader of the Liberal Democrats. Thank you very much for being with us. Let's just show you the latest pictures from Conservative Party headquarters. There is Mr Johnson, fresh from hearing that he has won the party leadership with 66% of the vote. 160,000 Conservative Party members in all, and 87% of them voted. And so it was pretty much a 2-to-1 victory for Boris Johnson over his rival Jeremy Hunt, who he thanked for the campaign. And of course, tomorrow he will become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And that's him just going into Conservative Party headquarters. Of course, he has a lot of work still to do in terms of forming his team, choosing his cabinet and wider ministerial appointments as well. Well, let's discuss what happens next with the SNP's Westminster leader, Ian Blackford, who joins me now. Thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Good afternoon.
On a very hot afternoon.
A very hot afternoon in Westminster, yeah.
What's your reaction to the news? Everyone was expecting it. It has come to pass. And he, as I say, got 66%, 2/3 of the vote.
Yeah, I don't think there's any surprise on that. I think everyone expected that. Boris Johnson has put himself forward as a candidate to defeat the Brexit party, so we're seeing the Conservative Party in some senses actually adopt a much harder position. Both the candidates ultimately were saying that they would take Britain out of the EU on a no-deal basis, something that we see as absolutely catastrophic. You know, what I really do think is interesting though is that Parliament last week voted by a majority of 51 votes to stop Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament. We've had ministerial resignations over the last few days, and of course we've even had one Conservative ex-minister that's talked about a motion of no confidence. This is unprecedented, that a Prime Minister-elect, before he gets his feet under the table, is facing opposition not just from the SNP and the Labour and the Liberal Democrats, but it's facing opposition from within his own party. And I would say,
do you think you can stop a no-deal Brexit if it comes to that?
I do. I'm much more confident than I've ever been, because in a sense that majority last week against proroguing Parliament is a proxy for a majority against a no-deal Brexit. And I would say to parliamentarians across the chamber to recognise the damage that no deal will do. We had the report from the Office of Budget Responsibility that came out last week showing that the UK would be in a recession if there's a no deal Brexit. It is the height of irresponsibility, I believe, for any politician to inflict economic harm on their constituents, and that's what a no-deal Brexit would do.
But do you think Parliament will definitely have a say on stopping a no-deal Brexit?
We have to find a mechanism, and I believe that we can do, because we have to amend the legislation which is already there. I accept the default position is that we will be leaving on a no-deal basis in the light of Boris Johnson not being able to do a deal. So it's a very serious situation, and Parliament has got to take its responsibilities. I believe it will. I believe that we will find a way of bringing a bill forward that will amend the Withdrawal Act that will stop us coming off the cliff edge. Boris Johnson will be stopped in his tracks by Parliament. So this is going to be a very brief honeymoon that he is going to get over the course of the next few weeks. And let me also say, the idea that Boris Johnson is going to be able to negotiate a new deal is simply for the birds. Michel Barnier has made it clear again, as the EU has done on many occasions, that the Withdrawal Act will not be opened up. There will be discussions about the political agreement, but the fundamentals of the Withdrawal Act will not change. So when we are in an impasse, Boris is not going to be able to fix this. Parliament's going to have to do its job.
Ian Blackford from the SNP, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Well, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has stated that he hopes Mr Johnson's experience as Mayor of London himself will mean that the pair can have a successful working relationship and improve the policing of London.
Well, this is why I need Londoners' support. I need Londoners to be on my side. I need London MPs to be on my side, London councils on my side, London businesses on my side, parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts on my side, to persuade this Prime Minister why it's crucial for our country's well-being for us to have the cuts reversed that were made 9 years ago. The cuts that were made 9 years ago was an experiment in shrinking the size of the state, and it's failed. When you look at the evidence, one of the reasons, not the only reason, one of the reasons for the increase in serious youth violence, for the increase in violent crime, is the cuts made to preventative services, public services, youth services, as well as policing. One of the reasons why Londoners are being priced out of London is because successive governments have failed to make sure there are genuinely affordable homes built in our city. One of the reasons why we don't do as well as other cities around the world when it comes to the ability of city halls to affect things is we're one of the most centralised democracies in the Western world. The good news is Boris Johnson as Prime Minister should understand that because he's been a former mayor. And what I'm hoping is a combination of the fact that, you know, we in privately get on very well, and I'm hoping that that will mean that we can get some rewards for London, but also the fact that his experience of running this city will mean that we'll have from his administration even more support than we've had from previous administrations.
That's Sadiq Khan. Well, with me now we've got the Mirror's political editor, Pippa Crerar, and the Daily Mail's political editor, John Stevens, who joins me now as well. Thank you very much indeed. Pippa, what happens next? First of all, let's talk about what sort of cabinet Boris Johnson forms. Does he go for a solid Brexiteer cabinet, or does he bring in all wings of the party?
I think this is what everybody wants to know, because it'll be very telling about what sort of government he's going to lead, whether he is genuinely going to try and unite the party by bringing in some so-called Remainer cabinet ministers, hanging on to people like Amber Rudd and Matt Hancock, who had previously opposed no deal, but in recent weeks, seeing that he was going to be the man that was going to come on top in this contest, decided that they could live with it. Or whether he's going to bring in the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg, Steve Baker, some of the more hardline Brexiteers, and give the right wing of the Tory party, the Brexit wing of the Tory party, some faith that he's serious about his do-or-die pledge. Now, from what I'm hearing, it's actually going to be a bit of a balance, and we're told to expect probably a few more Remainer faces than you might otherwise be led to believe by some of the hard rhetoric that Boris Johnson has been coming out with. And also probably a slightly more diverse cabinet than we've had previously, maybe a few younger faces, maybe a few people that probably been very loyal to Boris Johnson for a long time and are finally getting their reward for that.
John, how do you see the top jobs? First of all, will Jeremy Hunt keep his job, do you think?
I think that is in Boris Johnson's gift now. If it had been a closer margin of victory, then I think he'd have had to give Jeremy Hunt a job. You know, he got almost twice as many votes as Jeremy Hunt, so it's, you know, within his gift now to decide whether he does or not. You know, I think if he's trying to bring the party together, he's trying to unite the party, then I think it would be quite helpful to bring in someone like Jeremy Hunt. Obviously, during the campaign, he was quite critical about Boris Johnson, but the last week or so kind of held his punches. And I think that would kind of be a sign that he wants to bring the party together if he did allow Jeremy Hunt to stay in his cabinet. But I think it depends what sort of role does he give him. Does he give him one of those top jobs, keep him as Foreign Secretary, or does he demote him to a role, you know, like Working Pensions Secretary, Environment Secretary?
Which he might not accept anyway. What about Chancellor of the Exchequer? Is that Sajid Javid, do you think?
The hot money has been, of course, on Sajid Javid, and he came in quite quickly behind Boris Johnson after he was knocked out the leadership contest himself. And he's seen as kind of like a safe pair of hands by the majority of the Conservative backbenches, because he was a reluctant Remainer in the Brexit referendum, but actually at heart is probably a Brexiteer. So he's also very Thatcherite in his economic policies, and you know, that would appeal to Boris Johnson's another who's Boris Johnson obviously being a fiscal Conservative as well as ostensibly a social liberal, so the hot money is on him. But of course there are other names floating around, and you know, Liz Truss is somebody that's been mentioned. She's obviously Chief Secretary at the Treasury at the moment. She really wants the top job, and of course Boris Johnson has promised to make one of the top jobs, give one of the top jobs to a woman. I mean, he should be, quite frankly, giving majority of them to women as far as I'm concerned, but certainly he's promised that there'll be balance in there, so maybe she'll get it. There are other people obviously that want it too. It's the number 2 job in government.
There are suggestions that there are a lot of people in his ear at the moment suggesting different sort of policy ideas now as to how to go forward with Brexit, you know, how hard to pursue a deal, for example. Is that how you see it, that he's hearing conflicting voices?
I think there's lots of different camps around Boris Johnson. You've got the people who are with him at City Hall, you've got kind of the hardline Brexiteers who've been fighting alongside him in the ERG. You know, I think the difficult thing for him to be is going to be how he's going to bring those groups together. But actually it's been quite a small group who's been with him, picking those people who go in the cabinet, which I think is going to set the tone for the next government.
Yeah, is that how you see it, Pippa? Because
absolutely.
It's not quite, we've heard lots of rhetoric, but we're not absolutely clear what he's going to do once he gets into number 10.
It's funny, isn't it? The closer that somebody gets to power, the more popular they become. And I remember talking to MPs, Tory MPs, not a few months ago, saying Boris Johnson isn't popular enough to get this job. We're unlikely to be able to get the support of Tory backbenchers, and yet there he is. He's done it. But he's retained a very close core of maybe half a dozen advisors, the majority of whom people he was with at City Hall around him to help him decide things like the cabinet and policy decisions. Munira Mirza, who was one of his deputy mayors at City Hall, is apparently going to be his policy chief in number 10. We've heard very little. The civil service has been given very little to deal with, and they basically know that he's got some plans for broadband and to throw some more money at school funding. But other than that, we know very little about what domestic policy agenda will be, what his priorities will be, and crucially, what he's going to do about Brexit. Is it going to be do or die, or is that just rhetoric, and is he going to go back to the European Union? And you know, somebody said to me a few weeks ago he's actually going to love bomb them. He's going to take them by surprise and try and get something out of them. It's not going to be going in there and being tough and hard and fast. So, you know, who knows? There's big questions to be answered.
Love bombed by Boris Johnson, the new Prime Minister. Interesting. OK, Pippa Crerar from the Mirror, John Stevens from the Mail, thank you very much indeed for being with us with your thoughts. OK, let's pause now and get all the latest business news for you. Jamie has that for us this afternoon.
Afternoon, I'm Jamie Robertson. We have the business news for you. Huawei has cut more than 600 jobs in the US at its research unit FutureWay. The telecoms giant said the job cuts were due to the curtailment of business operations caused by the US. Now, this, of course, is after Washington put the Chinese firm on a trade blacklist, which restricts its ability to trade with US firms. Supermarket sales have fallen for the first time in 3 years, but it was largely due to a record splurge by shoppers last year on traditional summer favourites like ice cream and alcohol, especially during the Men's Football World Cup. Sales over the last 3 months fell by about 0.5% compared to the same period last year. Now, if you want investors' reaction to the election of Boris Johnson to post a Prime Minister, well, the feeling's fairly mixed. The pound down about 0.5% against the dollar since the announcement. Stock market suddenly is up about 1%, about 80 points. Much of that movement is driven by the big exporters, Unilever, BP, Shell. They profit from a falling currency, of course, because they make their profits in foreign exchange. You've also got to remember the announcement was hardly unexpected, so you wouldn't expect any dramatic reaction. However, let's move on to companies themselves. What do they think? Let's turn to Adam Marshall, who's Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce. I know that you've got 15 demands. I don't want to go through all of them, which you want to make to Boris Johnson. What are the main things you feel? Let's do the top three in quick succession.
Well, thanks, Jamie. I won't go through all 15, but we do want to see the incoming Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, avoid a messy and disorderly Brexit. We don't think that that will be good for firms or communities anywhere in the UK. And we want to see him take some really swift action to boost business confidence. We run the biggest private business survey in the country, and the numbers that we've been seeing in recent months have not been good. So business is already not at a high water mark here. So an incoming Prime Minister has got to do a few things really fast to get business moving.
Do you want him to spend money on things like sort of bringing down rates or anything like that, or sort of apprenticeships and things like that?
Well, there is a mix of things he could do. First of all, he could stop the relentless increases in costs that businesses have been facing. There have been so many upfront costs on business that have been introduced in recent years, and those have got to come to an end. He could create some new tax incentives as well for firms to get investing. Business investment is at one of its lowest ebbs in a long time, so we need to get that moving. And yes, there should be some spending. There should be some spending on fixing the roads, getting our broadband and mobile signals up to scratch, and helping us train as many people as we can in this country. Those sorts of back-to-basics priorities have got to come to the fore over the next few weeks.
What's your feeling? Do you think he's responsive to these kind of demands? I mean, he has said several rather unpleasant, well, one particularly rather unpleasant word about business in the past. What's your feeling? What does he really think, do you think?
Well, I've been assured that he wants to take a very pro-business approach, but my firms will judge him on his actions, not his words. And some of those actions have got to be forthcoming very quickly over the coming weeks so that businesses can get their mojo back a little bit, get their confidence back.
OK, Adam Marshall from the British Chambers of Commerce. Thanks very much indeed. OK, that's all we've got time for in business, but we can move off to Westminster with Ben.
Jamie, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's talk about the result and Boris Johnson winning the party leadership. I'm joined by three young members of the Conservative Party who all voted: Lacey Butcher, Cameron Bradbury and Shakir Hussain. And you all voted. Now, first of all, Cameron, tell us, I think you voted for Boris Johnson.
I voted for Boris Johnson. I supported Michael Gove the first time round, but I think Boris had the numbers amongst the MPs to unite the party. I think he's a moderniser. I think he's very socially liberal, but fiscally conservative, and that's what I was looking for in a candidate.
So you're pleased? Are you surprised?
Not surprised, very pleased, and now we just get on with it, don't we? Sad to see Theresa May go, but...
You're a Theresa May
very much so.
supporter.
I thought her deal was a very good one. I think she'll be remembered very fondly.
OK. Shakir Hussain.
Yes, pro-Hunt supporter again, Theresa May with her deal. Obviously disappointed today, but we have to look to the future. I am naturally concerned with the parliamentary numeracy. The Parliament's on a knife edge at the moment. I don't think Boris is the person to be able to unite it, so we'll see what happens.
OK, and Lacey Butcher, how did you vote?
Boris Johnson, 100%. Very thrilled, absolutely thrilled. Hard work starts now, though. We need to unify. It sends a clear message to the rest of the Conservative members and the rest of the Conservative Party itself that we need to get on with Brexit now we have this mandate.
And get on how exactly? How hard would you like to see him work to get a deal with the EU?
Endlessly, day and night, of course. I mean, we've 100 days now, or even less. Time is ticking down. Boris now has to act quickly. He has to get an absolute certain cabinet in place, a cabinet that believes in Brexit, most importantly, and then get on with the negotiations.
Yeah. Is that how you see it, Cameron? I mean, because there's been a lot of talk during the campaign about a no-deal Brexit, about come what may, do or die, we're getting out by October the 31st.
So I think it would be, I voted for Brexit, but I voted to leave with a deal. I would like to leave with a deal. Of course, no deal has to be left on the table, I think. But I think Theresa May's deal is a good one. I think if Boris can get just a few changes and get, shall we say, some of the recalcitrant ERGers and the reluctant Labour people who said this time round they'll vote for it, I think it can get over the line.
Are you opposed to a no deal?
On principle, no, but I would very much like to exhaust every avenue to prevent that.
So if you were an MP, and I'm sure you will be one day, but if you were an MP, would you try to block a no deal?
No.
No. OK, what about you, Shakir Hussain? Now, you're a Jeremy Hunt supporter. Would you block a no deal?
I think it's very interesting to see what this rebel alliance that's been coming together through Philip Hammond, Rory Stewart and the rest of his consortia, along with Ken Clarke. I personally don't think a no-deal situation is right for the country. It will ruin our economy. The people who voted for Brexit, the majority will be the ones who will suffer from it. So I wouldn't know. I'd vote against it.
You would vote against a no deal? You'd try and stop it?
Like most people in Parliament are doing it.
So actually, I mean, even amongst yourselves, you're a microcosm of the party and indeed the country is still very disunited over Brexit.
But I'd like to think that, this large vote sends a clear message that we need to all unify now and just pursue Brexit.
But it sends a clear message from about 100,000 Conservative Party members.
Yes, and that's how the system works. We were decided to pick a new party leader, and that's what we've done. And let's get on with the job.
What about the people who say Boris Johnson doesn't have great attention to detail, that just in terms of doing the job of the Prime Minister, he's actually not going to be very good?
I beg to differ. I think that Boris Johnson has an astounding track record, both twice his premierships as London Mayor. He did a fantastic job in the Foreign Office.
As Foreign Secretary as well?
I don't think that's accurate. I don't think his Foreign Office experience was that outstanding. I think he's able to do local government, of course. When it comes to the national scene, I think he will struggle.
I disagree. Yeah. I think he was only in the Foreign Office for a very short time. Obviously, he resigned. I thought that was the wrong decision to make. But we saw him stand up to Trump over the travel ban, for example. We saw him champion women's rights abroad. So I think he did a good job.
Good to talk to all of you. Lacey, Cameron, Shakir, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Several young Conservatives there with their views of the leadership. Let's get a look at the weather now, and I can tell you it is Scorchio, but Darren Betts has got the latest forecast.
Oh, you're going all technical on me, Ben. It's a hot day. Yes, you best to be in the shade today. It's already 32 Celsius in London and Jersey. That, of course, is 90 Fahrenheit, and the heat is building northwards into Scotland as well. But the highest temperatures are going to be widely across England and Wales, above 30 degrees in many places, a peak of 35 Celsius later this afternoon in around the London area. But that heat and humidity, it's very sticky out there. It's going to lead to some thundery downpours arriving from the southwest, the Channel Islands, heading northwards up towards Scotland. Many places will get some very wet weather overnight. It's going to be a very noisy night. Could be some very gusty winds and some hail in there as well. It's also going to be very muggy, particularly uncomfortable towards the southeast corner of England, where it may well stay dry. Those were the minimum temperatures. As we head into tomorrow, the last of the overnight rain clears away from Scotland, leaving behind one or two showers, but on the whole it's turning dry, it's turning sunny once again. Slight change in the wind direction means the heat is going to be more on across the eastern side of England, 33, maybe 34 degrees. But then that continental heat comes back again on Thursday. That's when we could break the July record with a high in the southeast around 37 Celsius.
What happens if your mom rejects you? That's gonna hit me hard.
What are little black girls going to think of you for protecting white supremacists?
Our World is a unique series of films on the BBC, offering personal insights into global events. Our World, stories that speak for themselves, this weekend on the BBC News Channel.
This is BBC News. It's 3 o'clock. I'm Ben Brown, live at Westminster. Our headlines. Boris Johnson is elected as the new Conservative Party leader and will become Britain's next Prime Minister.
Deliver Brexit, unite the country and defeat Jeremy Corbyn. And that is what we're going to do.
He beat Jeremy Hunt in a poll of Tory party members, winning almost 2/3 of the vote. Mr Johnson has promised to deliver Brexit by October the 31st, saying it is do or die. The new EU Commission President warns of challenging times ahead. And President Trump has already congratulated Mr Johnson, saying he'll be great.
I'm Rebecca Jones. The other main headline at 3. A heatwave is spreading across the UK, with temperatures expected to climb to well over 30 degrees Celsius this week.
Hello, very good afternoon to you from Westminster. So now we know, and in the end, well, there was no great surprise. Boris Johnson was favourite to win from the very start, and now he has been voted in as the new Conservative Party leader. He will officially take office as Prime Minister tomorrow after a meeting with the Queen at Buckingham Palace. Mr Johnson gained around double the votes that Jeremy Hunt did from Conservative Party members, and in his victory speech, he promised to unite the country and to deliver Brexit by the deadline of the 31st of October. But he's already seen some ministerial resignations, and there could be more, as several cabinet ministers have already said they can't support his do-or-die pledge to leave the EU. Ian Watson, our political correspondent, has our first report this afternoon.
He walked in first but finished second. Jeremy Hunt was decisively defeated by Boris Johnson. For many, the former Foreign Secretary was the face of Brexit, the mop-topped figurehead of Vote Leave. And that probably appealed to the 2/3 of Conservative members who gave them their support. He said he'd take Britain out of the EU by the end of October, and his acceptance speech was a cocktail of optimism and humour with only the slightest dash of detail.
And we know the mantra of the campaign that has just gone by. In case you've forgotten it, you probably have. It is deliver Brexit, unite the country and defeat Jeremy Corbyn. And that is what we're going to do. And I know some wag has already pointed out that deliver, unite and defeat was not the perfect acronym for an election campaign, since unfortunately it spells dud. But they forgot the final E, my friends. E for energise.
He seems to have already united his family, though some have very different views on Brexit. But he romped through some of his other policy ambitions too.
And we are once again going to believe in ourselves and what we can achieve. And like some slumbering giant, we are going to rise and ping off the guy ropes of self-doubt and negativity with better education, better infrastructure, more police, fantastic full fibre broadband sprouting in every household.
Theresa May promised to support Boris Johnson from the backbenches, but not everyone in the Conservative Party is going to be so generous. The announcement of the new Conservative leader was made here, but the real challenges begin tomorrow when he moves just round the corner into Downing Street. Boris Johnson has said that he'll take us off the hamster wheel of doom, as he calls it, and get Britain out of the European Union by the end of October. If he doesn't do that, his time in Downing Street may be limited. If he does do that, but without a deal, he'll be facing not just the opposition, but the unofficial opposition, senior members of Theresa May's government who are prepared to rebel against him. Another former Foreign Secretary believes Boris Johnson could face some significant hurdles here in Parliament.
There are at least, probably in my estimation, up to 50 Tory MPs who will not support no deal. And as long as he seems to be talking in that sort of language, he will lose every vote in the House of Commons.
This is one minister who won't serve under Boris Johnson. David Gauke's colleagues who oppose no deal have been dubbed the Gawkward Squad.
There is a clear majority in the House of Commons that doesn't want to leave the EU without a deal. I think that will become very clear in the autumn. That'll be underlined in the autumn. I think there may well be ways in which Parliament finds an ability to make it clear what it thinks and that is binding upon the new Prime Minister.
And the Education Minister, Anne Milton, resigned today. She was concerned that Britain could leave the EU with no deal.
I wish the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, well in his negotiations with the EU, but I have always had grave concerns about leaving the EU without a deal in place.
But one prominent Boris Johnson supporter was rather looking down on those who choose to criticise him.
There is no scope now for self-indulgence and individual MPs just expressing their own views. For the Conservative Party to deliver for our country, we have to unite, we have to come together.
How are you feeling, Mr Hunt?
Boris Johnson's opponent admitted that he was disappointed and called for unity. And this was his diagnosis for his failure to win.
This was always going to be uphill for us because I was someone who voted Remain. We have a Prime Minister who voted Remain, and I think lots of Conservative Party members felt that this was a moment when you just had to have someone who voted for Brexit in the referendum. And that was, in retrospect, that was a hurdle we were never able to overcome.
The future's uncertain for Larry the Downing Street cat, and indeed for the country. The new Prime Minister has a wafer-thin majority, even with Northern Ireland's DUP on side. Boris Johnson moves in here tomorrow. It's not clear how long his tenure will last. Ian Watson, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's get the latest live from our chief political correspondent, Vicki Young, who's at Conservative Party headquarters. Boris Johnson has been there. Is he still there, Vicki?
Yep, he's still here. We were told he was going to be here for a couple of hours, and then he's due to address Conservative backbenchers in the House of Commons at around 4 o'clock this afternoon. So he's here, presumably talking to staff here at headquarters and, of course, working on assembling his new cabinet, his top team. We understand that he has already appointed Mark Spencer as his chief whip. Now, the whips, of course, the people who are in charge of party discipline, who make sure that MPs vote in the way they're supposed to and support the government when they're supposed to. And, of course, a very, very, very difficult job when there is really no majority for the Conservatives in the House of Commons because there's a hung parliament. It's going to be a very difficult task. Now, Mark Spencer is someone who has spent time in the Whip's office before the appointment was made public. I was talking to some Conservative MPs. They were all speculating he might get that job, said he was very popular with MPs, which, of course, always helps. So a lot of chat about what kind of Prime Minister Boris Johnson is going to be. His friends have talked about his time as Mayor of London, a lot of them making the comparison with Ronald Reagan, saying that he's a figurehead, he leads the charge, he sets the tone, he of course makes the decisions, but gets around him people who can make things happen behind the scenes. So that's the template, if you like, that they are talking about. They'll say that that's what Boris Johnson did as Mayor of London. But of course, his critics will point out it's completely different. Being Prime Minister is a very different prospect. His critics also look at his time as Foreign Secretary and say that actually the gaffes, some of them, had very dire consequences, that it was not a success in that role. And so I think the critics will say that he's not really up to the job of that.
And I know he spent the last few days with his close aides putting together his new government team. What sort of cabinet are we expecting? Is this going to be an inclusive cabinet that might include Remainers? Is he going to go for a pure kind of Brexiteer sort of cabinet? Will he give Jeremy Hunt a job? Who will be the Chancellor? Lots of questions for you, Vicki.
Yeah, and no one does know the answer to all of this. You know, I think the problems that Theresa May had, she of course had a very balanced cabinet in terms of those who were for Remain and those who were for Brexit when it came to the referendum. Boris Johnson has to make a decision about whether he just has people who are willing to go along with what he wants, which is ultimately that he's prepared to leave at the end of October without a deal. Now, would people like Amber Rudd, for example, who seems to have changed her mind on that, would they be included? She's of course one of the few senior female MPs, cabinet ministers who've been in senior roles, and I'm sure he will want to reflect that kind of diversity. Others are saying the diversity might come from having more cabinet ministers from ethnic backgrounds, Sajid Javid being tipped as a possible chancellor, a return maybe for Priti Patel. But I think they will have to sign up to Boris Johnson's vision and the possibility that he would leave without a deal. And for some of them that is going to be too much. We know already people like Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, says he will resign, David Gauke as well as other ministers. So that is the big question for Boris Johnson in the coming days.
Vicki, for the moment, thank you. Vicki Young, our chief political correspondent. And I'm joined here live at Westminster now by the Shadow Transport Secretary, Labour's Andy MacDonald. Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Mr Johnson is saying that he is the man who can defeat Jeremy Corbyn in an election whenever it comes. Could be pretty soon. Do you fear Boris Johnson as the Tory party leader?
I fear him as a Prime Minister. I think he's dangerous, he's reckless, he's incompetent, and he can't be trusted. And his first instincts are to deliver a tax cut for the richest in our society. He really doesn't give a care about people in my constituency. This is just a Tory party elite game. They think this is a sense of entitlement. Less than 100,000 people have now put the next Prime Minister in place. There's more people voted for Ed Balls in Strictly Come Dancing than Boris Johnson had votes.
How many people chose Jeremy Corbyn as Labour Party leader?
Hundreds of thousands of people chose him as our leader, and when he goes to the country to seek election as our Prime Minister, millions and millions of people will have that ability to vote for the Labour Party should they so wish. That's how democracy works, and that's how it should work on this occasion. But this man's
that is,
character...
I mean, parties elect their leaders, so just the fact that the Conservative Party membership voted for a leader, there's nothing unusual in that, surely?
No, there isn't. But you know, it's a very small number, and we're at such a crucial moment of our country's history. Never has there been in my lifetime a more delicate or difficult time, and we now have a Prime Minister who, amongst all the people in the House of Commons, he's singly the most unfit individual to be our Prime Minister, and people are right to be extraordinarily worried about the future of our nation.
Well, unless they're Leave voters, because they'll be delighted probably, won't they? Well, because he is saying he will deliver what they voted for 3 years ago, come what may, do or die, by October the 31st.
They didn't, those Leave voters did not vote to trash our economy and see our manufacturing base reduced to nil. In my part of the world, the steel industry will be impacted, as will chemicals, automotive and the pharmaceuticals industry. This will, if he gets his way, and does a sweetheart deal with Donald Trump and gives up our NHS to American predatory interests, we're in deep trouble. And so this is a very, very worrying day for the United Kingdom. And in fact, it's an existential threat to the United Kingdom. Whether we survive this as a unified kingdom, Lord alone knows. But we are in peril because of the election of Boris Johnson today. And I, for one, am extraordinarily worried about it.
But what if he goes and he gets a deal? Is there any way that you could support a deal that he might negotiate with the European Union if they were prepared to reopen the withdrawal agreement and discuss that with him?
If that's possible between now and the 31st of October, I'd be extraordinarily surprised. But if
you talked to Theresa May,
if he was able to secure a customs union and a single market deal where we've got regulatory alignment that would sustain the transfer of goods across this continent of ours, that would be worth listening to. I think the chances of that happening are nil, and so we're heading for a catastrophic crash out under Boris Johnson, which will be ruinous for us.
Isn't the truth that at least people know what Boris Johnson thinks about Brexit? They know where he stands on Brexit. They still don't really know where the Labour Party stands on Brexit.
Well, let me tell you, up against this no deal and up against any deal that comes out of the House of Commons, that has to go back to the people in a second referendum, and the Labour Party will campaign to remain in the European Union. I hope that's clear, because no deal means no
People
steel.
aren't clear whether Jeremy Corbyn is a Remainer or a Leaver.
Automotive. He's made it clear. He voted Remain. He campaigned for Remain, as did I.
Didn't campaign very hard, did he?
Well, if you look at his diary, I think you'll find that he did do an awful lot of work in that campaign. I know it's almost established folklore now to say that he didn't put his shoulder to the wheel, but he did. The reality
So
is,
in his heart of hearts, Jeremy Corbyn is a Remainer?
Of course, because that's the position we've got to as a party. That's what we decide. He's a Democrat, and we worked through our democratic processes at the party. We wanted to respect the outcome, but no deal was said at the time, and in our manifesto, that was an anathema. We couldn't have a no-deal exit from the European Union. It would be catastrophic for our economy, and that's exactly the position we're in today.
Good to talk to you, Andy McDonald, Shadow Transport Secretary. Thank you very much for being with us live here at Westminster. Let's speak now to our correspondent Phil Mackey, who's joining us from Worcester, where he's been looking into the reactions amongst grassroots Conservatives. Phil.
Yeah, Ben, this is one of those key marginal seats. It's a bellwether seat, Worcester. It's voted with the country in every referendum, every election since 1975, and it's very high on the Labour target seat. So it's going to be an important election battleground at the next general election. It also voted to leave by 53.7%, so not far off the national average there. So it was really interesting, I think, to spend the morning with grassroots Conservatives at the Conservative Association, watching the news as it came in and getting their reaction to the idea that their new leader and the next Prime Minister will be Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson presents the greatest appeal to the greatest number of people across the country, and I think he has the ability to squeeze out the Brexit Party.
Well, I supported Jeremy Hunt because of how decisive his answers were, and how well I felt he stuck to how he felt about certain issues, and I'm still happy with Boris Johnson as leader, because I find that his charismatic nature is obviously very well known, but I quite enjoy how he takes what people want and goes with it.
I think out of him and Jeremy Hunt, he's definitely the one to beat Jeremy Corbyn, which is the biggest threat to the Conservative Party at the moment. And I think he also has a good relationship with Donald Trump, and if anyone can assert their position against Donald Trump in any negotiation, I think it'd be Boris Johnson.
How did you vote?
I voted for Boris.
And you're happy with?
Yes, very.
And why?
Because I think he's dynamic. I also think he's a little bit like Marmite. You either like him or loathe him. But I think he is a dynamic statesman.
I'd love to see a good Labour leader one day to keep the Tories on their toes. But I think for the time being, Boris Johnson would be good. I think he'll sort out Brexit, and I think he could win an election for the Tories.
And that's the key thing here, because, as I said, it's a Labour target. It's number 44 on their list in a general election. They need around that number in a uniform swing to become the largest party and therefore be likely to be the next government. And you heard Victoria, one of the people who I spoke to in the Conservative Association earlier on, saying he's a bit like Marmite, but I like him. I put it to her that means some people probably won't like him very much, and it's those people that you need to get to vote Conservative at the next general election. She said that she thought he would persuade them, and that's what Boris Johnson will hope to do. He didn't come here during the leadership campaign, Jeremy Hunt did. The 5 people you just saw talking to me this morning didn't all support Boris Johnson to begin with, but I think, Ben, by today they were all pretty happy that he is their next leader and the new Prime Minister from tomorrow.
Yeah, indeed, Phil, thank you very much indeed. Phil Mackey there for us in Worcester. Well, let's go to the United States, because Donald Trump has congratulated Mr Johnson on becoming the new Prime Minister and new Tory leader, becomes Prime Minister tomorrow, of course. Donald Trump said he will be great. Let's cross to our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue, who's in Washington. And Gary, we know that these two men are friends, really, aren't they?
Yes. I would say that's possibly true. I mean, they've had some issues in the past, bear in mind, Ben. Don't forget when Donald Trump talks about London having no-go areas, Boris Johnson had a right pop at him over that, and Boris Johnson also had a big go at him over the attempt to introducing a ban on people from Muslim countries. So there have been disagreements in the past, but I think Boris Johnson's less than fulsome, if you like, endorsement of Sir Kim Darroch, the ambassador here, when those leaked emails emerged criticising the Trump administration, that will have done no harm. And we do know that the President spoke to Boris Johnson at the end of last week by telephone. Clear indication, I think, at the time then that they had no doubt whatsoever who would be the next British Prime Minister. And as these things always are, the choreography of what Boris Johnson does when he goes through that black door tomorrow is key. And I have absolutely no doubt that one of the very first things he will do is put in a call to the Oval Office.
Yeah, because there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about the United States and a possible trade deal with the United States being one of Mr Johnson's top priorities. So maybe an early visit to Washington could be on the cards.
I think there's no doubt about that. I think that's, I mean, there's a bit of a toss-up here whether or not Boris Johnson does a European tour of capitals to try and reopen the deal, if you like, renegotiate the deal, or whether he comes here first. But a visit to Washington will be very early on the agenda. There's no question about that. He will want to present a united front here in the Oval Office. He will want to get some warm words from the President about that trade deal, which, after all, is the great sort of peace dividend that the Brexiteers have been promising all along if he gets to the other side of Brexit. But there will also be difficulties. Bear in mind, at the moment, top of the sort of the foreign policy challenges that Boris Johnson will face is the question of Iran, this impounded tanker, the tension with Iran that's happening at the moment. And that tension also exists in the relationship with the US over what to do about Iran, because Britain is with its European allies on this in not wanting to end the nuclear deal that the Americans pulled out of last year.
And Mr Johnson has to appoint a new ambassador, doesn't he? I mean, that could be a pivotal role. There was even speculation it might be somebody like Nigel Farage at one stage.
Yes, I mean, I think that would be enormously controversial. We'll see what he does. But yes, he will get to pick, and there will be a lot of scrutiny, and I'm sure he will want to go through the absolute normal channels, because the last thing he will want people to be able to say is that he's kind of rolled to the President's pressure and picked some sort of person who is associated in any way with that point of view. He will want it to be a straight down the line diplomat. I'm pretty sure of that, and that will be a big choice that will be scrutinised closely in the coming days. And they can't leave that thing vacant for too long, because it is a key relationship. You can't have that empty for that long.
Gary, good to talk to you. Thank you very much. Gary O'Donoghue there, our Washington correspondent. So in Mr Johnson's inbox, Brexit is absolutely his top priority, and Chris Morris from BBC's Reality Check is here with me now to remind us about some of the things he said during the campaign. But he said a lot, do or die, come what may, we're leaving by October the 31st. And yet, in some ways, we don't really know what he's planning to do about Brexit once he gets into number 10.
No, it's interesting. I mean, I think that phrase you mentioned is possibly the most single striking thing he said during the campaign, that the UK would leave the EU by October the 31st, do or die, deal or no deal, which implies whatever the consequences. One of the things it means, of course, is that you need to seriously start ramping up preparations for leaving with no deal. We know a lot of preparation was done in government in the run-up to the end of March. A lot of that has then been sort of put on the back burner. He's going to bring it back to the front burner very, very quickly. But he's also said he thinks that if no deal were to happen, it would be vanishingly inexpensive. Those were his words. Now, that isn't something that the majority of economists think. It's not something that a significant chunk of his own backbenchers think, or the Office for Budget Responsibility. He still says, he has said during this campaign, he thinks no deal is unlikely and that he can get this deal. What's he want to do? The problem is what he wants to do are things which the EU's already ruled out. Number one, dump the Irish backstop, not tweak it, not issue some sort of legal clarification to it, simply get rid of it altogether. And then the second thing he suggested he wants to do is withhold the divorce bill, the £39 billion that Theresa May's government has said it's not going to pay. He wants to deal with all those things after Brexit has happened. And the EU's been saying, well, hang on a minute, don't think we're going to suddenly talk to you about trade if you rip up all those agreements, because the first thing we'd want to talk to you about after a no deal would be the Irish border, the money and citizens' rights, all the things that have been so painstakingly put in the withdrawal agreement. So it's an incredibly tight schedule.
One moment during the campaign sticks in the memory when he held up a kipper and talked about how the EU had messed around with our kippers.
He did, yeah. So it was a kipper which had been sent by a kipper smoker on the Isle of Man, saying the EU's made me put in a frozen bag to send this to consumers. Now, we looked into this, we talked to the European Commission, we talked to the UK Food Standards Agency, and they both agreed, no, it wasn't an EU regulation that enforced the idea that there had to be some sort of refrigeration in the packaging. It was a UK regulation. But the interesting thing, in a way, is that it doesn't really matter for his supporters whether it was true or not. They like the fact that he was holding this kipper up in the air, railing against Brussels bureaucrats. And he has a bit of a history of this, let's face it. You go back to his time as a journalist in Brussels, bendy bananas, Italian condoms, the list goes on. And I think the point is, it's kind of okay if you're a Daily Telegraph journalist working in Brussels. Maybe it's okay when you're the Mayor of London. But is it going to be okay when you're Prime Minister? Because you're under the sort of scrutiny that even someone who's been as much in the public eye as Mr. Johnson has never experienced before.
Chris, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. I'll hand you back to Rebecca in a moment. Let me just tell you, though, that the DUP and their leader, Arlene Foster, have put out a statement. I have spoken with Boris Johnson, says Arlene Foster, and congratulated him on becoming leader of the Conservative Party. We have discussed our shared objectives of strengthening every part of the union, ensuring that the 2016 referendum result is implemented and seeing devolution restored in Northern Ireland. The confidence and supply agreement between the Conservative Party and the DUP remains. So that is from Arlene Foster. We'll bring you more details on that throughout the afternoon. But in the meantime, let's go back to Rebecca in the studio.
Thanks, Ben, and back to you at Westminster in a few moments. Before that, though, forecasters expect temperatures to rise throughout the week, with a heat wave predicted to bring temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius over the next few days. On Thursday, it's even possible temperatures could beat the highest ever recorded in the UK, which was 38.5 Celsius, set in Faversham in Kent, and that was in August 2003. Joining us now is Caroline Davis, our reporter who is at Regent's Park in London. Caroline, it's hot. What should we all be doing?
It certainly is hot. It's been heating up here all day and you can really feel it coming up through the ground here in Regent's Park. People have been enjoying the heat, having their lunch breaks out here as well. Just around the corner is London Zoo. We've heard that the lions there are being fed blood ice lollies to try and cool down. Now, across the country, people are also experiencing the heat in different and possibly more negative ways as well. We've heard that in Berkshire, they have in Newbury, they've decided to give out cool drinks to rough sleepers who will be obviously struggling these sorts of temperatures. We've also heard that in Oxford, a judge has sent a jury home because they were struggling to deliberate in the heat. They're going to try and find a cooler room for them tomorrow. But across the country, other people have been able to enjoy the weather as well, as Duncan Kennedy has been finding out in Bournemouth.
As schools break up, the fun breaks out. This is Britain's oldest seawater pool, where you see water, you go for it.
What sort of temperatures can you take?
As hot as you like.
She's hot stuff.
It's factor 50 all the way, with temperatures nudging the late 20s. Is it hot enough for you?
It is lovely. I mean, this is almost as nice as being in Spain at the moment, isn't it?
Do you have to take care of this kind of weather?
Well, I do, because I've got a lot of freckles and I've got fair skin, so I have to take care that I do put in the, factor like 30 or something like that. But otherwise, I'm just happy to be here.
So what's going on? Well, as the jet stream eases north of the United Kingdom, European and African weather is surging in behind, creating these temperatures by Thursday.
Well, we're going to tap into what's been happening across parts of Western Europe. High pressure's been in charge there. Things are very dry. The ground's dry, sunshine overhead. That's been warming things up. They're now bringing a little bit of African warmth too, and that all starts to trundle our way from here on.
In London, pavement thermals reveal the shimmering effects of the heat. It's fine for some who can cool off, but for elderly people, this can be an oppressive time.
Age UK recommends that if you have an older family member or neighbour that you check in with them during the hot weather to make sure that they're keeping hydrated, that they're coping, wearing light clothing and keeping the blinds shut during the day to keep their home cool.
In Clacton on the east coast, the only wind was offshore. The heat here sapping people, pets and plants.
Well, this weather we absolutely soak the ground about 3 times a week, 2 to 3 times, and if we didn't do that within a week on this weather, they would all just die, and that would be the end of them. Yes, you've got to keep on of them all the time.
Cross the country and you find Cardiff baking along with many others. A time for relaxation, but also responsibility. Public Health England are warning about pollution levels, along with Saharan dust that may bring some troublesome particles. After Britain's last mini heat wave in May, this really is summer's second act. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News.
Well, the heat has been so extreme that Public Health England have also issued a health heat alert, level 3. Now, level 4 is national emergency. Level 3 is more to tell social and health services to be on alert. It's particularly relevant if you're elderly, for babies and young children, or if you have a long-standing health complaint as well. But the advice goes for pretty much everybody. Of course, it's to stay hydrated. Now, that's not just about having a bottle of water. It's also about the sort of foods that you might be eating as well. Having things with high water content like strawberries, melon, cucumber all help as well. Now, particularly if you want to try and have a good night's sleep, the advice is to have a cool or tepid shower or bath before you go to bed. It's particularly difficult at the moment because it's expected to be very humid and muggy, which means it's difficult for sweat to evaporate from your body, leaving you quite hot and uncomfortable during the night. And of course, during the day, to have loose, cool-fitting clothing as well, and possibly a hat, or as much as you can, to try and stay in the shade and out of direct sunlight as well. Now, when there's an extreme weather event, quite often the question now is about climate change and its impact. It is very difficult to attribute a heat wave directly to climate change. That's not really possible. However, according to the Met Office, over the last 10 years or so, the hot periods have been longer than before, and there's also a suggestion from scientists again that back-to-back heat waves do increase with rising temperatures.
Caroline, thank you very much. Caroline Davis there in Regent's Park. And staying with the heat wave, let's get even more news about the weather. Here's Darren Bett.
Hello there. It's certainly a hot day out there for many of us. We're seeing the highest temperatures across England and Wales, widely 30 degrees plus, with the peak of the heat likely to be around the London area at around 35 degrees. Very hot, but also very humid, and that's going to lead to some thunderstorms developing overnight. Initially, some thundery downpours moving across the Channel Islands into the West Country, Wales, not far from the southeast of England and all that heat, up into the Midlands, Northern England, towards Northern Ireland and Scotland. Very few places staying dry. The rain could be torrential, accompanied by some hail and very gusty winds. It's also going to be very humid and uncomfortable night towards the southeast in particular, where it may well stay dry. But a lot of places are going to get some very wet weather overnight, a noisy night as well. It becomes drier during the morning, sunshine developing far and wide. Slight change in the wind direction means that for many western areas it won't be quite as hot as today, and even towards eastern England, where we'll see the highest temperatures, it's going to be a peak of 33 or 34.
What happens if your mom rejects you? That's gonna hit me hard.
What are little black girls going to think of you for protecting white supremacists?
Our World is a unique series of films on the BBC, offering personal insights into global events. Our World, stories that speak for themselves, this weekend on the BBC News Channel.
Hello, this is BBC News. I'm Rebecca Jones. The headlines. Boris Johnson is elected as the new Conservative leader and will become the next UK Prime Minister. Mr Johnson has promised to deliver Brexit by October the 31st, saying it's do or die. The new EU Commission President warns of challenging times ahead. And President Trump has already congratulated Boris Johnson, saying he will be great. And a heat wave is spreading across the UK, with temperatures expected to climb to well over 30 degrees Celsius this week.
Well, welcome back to Westminster. Let's bring you more now on the news that Boris Johnson has, as expected, been elected new leader of the Conservative Party, emphatically beating his rival Jeremy Hunt, taking 66% of the membership vote on an 87% turnout. And in his acceptance speech, Mr Johnson paid tribute to his opponent, as well as to Theresa May, who he will replace as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom tomorrow. Let's discuss what he's going to do once he's in Downing Street with Nicky Morgan, the Conservative MP for Loughborough, who originally backed Michael Gove in this leadership campaign. And you haven't said who of Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson you supported.
No, I haven't declared, because by the time Michael had been eliminated, we were onto the member stage, and my vote doesn't count any more than the party members' vote, so I've told absolutely no one who I voted for.
What sort of Prime Minister will Boris Johnson make?
Well, I think that is to be determined. I mean, you know, during the campaign, both with members and with the MPs, it was a debate between, is it Boris who was the London mayor, or is it Boris who we saw leading the Vote Leave campaign? I think the appointment of Mark Spencer as Chief Whip is a really good sign that actually he's determined to bring the party together. Mark is not known for being on one wing or the other. He's a very talented whip, and we wait to see, obviously, when the other appointments unfold over the next, 24, 48 hours, I guess.
Would you urge him to bring in Remainers into his cabinet to have a broad spectrum of the Tory party, or will it be quite an ideological, purist Brexiteer kind of cabinet?
Well, I hope not the latter. I co-chair something called the One Nation Caucus of Conservative MPs. We're on the moderate wing of the party. I think hopefully with people like Amber Rudd and Matt Hancock will very much stay in cabinet. There must be a role for Jeremy Hunt too. And I think it's very important that actually all views around the party are represented around the cabinet table. Boris will have a clear view of what he wants to do on Brexit, which I think he'll explain to people as he appoints them. And of course, if people feel they can't sign up to that, then they're right to say, well, that's not for me. And he's right to say, no, I want somebody else in my cabinet.
So you mean he should only, I mean, he said he's prepared for a no deal, do or die by October the 31st and so on. So does that mean people who won't sign up to that can't be in his government?
Well, I think it depends on how. I think that for many people there is a difference between somebody actively running towards a no deal, and we know that there were some candidates in the leadership contest who actively wanted. So look, the negotiation's over, the EU is not going to budge, we're going to go for a no deal. I don't think Boris is in that category. He's made it very clear when he came to the One Nation hustings that he did want there to be a deal. That's absolutely his preferred solution, but he's not going to take no deal off the table, and that's the judgment that people will have to make.
But what are his chances of getting a deal where Theresa May couldn't get a deal that she could get through this place? Has Boris Johnson got any better chance?
I think he has, actually. Partly just a new leader has new political capital to expend, both in terms of jobs but in other issues. I think many people voted for him thinking that he would win a general election if we got to that stage. And I've been working on something called the Alternative Arrangements Commission about the Irish border to try to solve that, to avoid a physical border, but not to have the backstop as it's currently constituted. What we don't know is how Boris is going to take those ideas forward.
So you think that his sort of government is going to be quite an inclusive government? Because a lot of his rhetoric, frankly, during the campaign has not been very inclusive, has it?
Well, I think it has at times. I went to one of the hustings, and actually he did make a play of wanting to unify the party. He made it very clear in letters back to the One Nation caucus that we had sent him asking for his plans and everything else. I think he said that his two first domestic priorities are social care and school funding, and I would agree with absolutely both of those as being,
Is he going to have time for any of that sort of stuff?
Well, I hope so, because actually it's one of the big mistakes the last 3 years is that we don't appear to have had time. And for many people, actually Brexit, people in my constituency of Loughborough and elsewhere, Brexit is not uppermost in their mind. They do care about social care. They do care about their child's funding. They care about NHS funding. And I think that what the Boris we're going to see is somebody who is confident enough to appoint ministers, set what he wants them to do, the direction, and then let them get on with it. That's what we haven't seen really over the last 3 years, and I think it's what we've missed.
Vicki Morgan, thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Well, European leaders have been swift to congratulate Mr Johnson, amongst them the European Commission's recently elected President, Ursula von der Leyen.
First of all, congratulations to Boris Johnson to be nominated as Prime Minister. And I'm looking forward to have a good working relation with him. There are many different and difficult issues to tackle together. We have challenging times ahead of us. I think it is very important to build up a strong and a good working relation, because we have the duty to deliver something which is good for people in Europe and in the United Kingdom. So I'm looking forward to working with him. Thank you.
Well, that was Ursula von der Leyen. Well, joining me now here at Westminster is Bronwyn Maddox, Director of the non-partisan think tank, the Institute for Government, and also Tom Swarbrick, former advisor to Theresa May. Thank you very much for being with us. Bronwyn, so he's got in, not surprising, 66% of the vote. Yep. What happens now? I was just talking to Nicky Morgan about what kind of government, what kind of cabinet he forms. Well, is that going to be the crucial?
Yes, the cabinet is going to be the first step that everyone is going to look at to see whether he is just, as you were discussing, going to go for the purist side, of the purist interpretation of Brexit, and perhaps a no-deal Brexit at that, or whether he's really going to try and bring Remainers in and bring the party with him. And he's going to have to do that if he's going to get support from Parliament. We've had all this talk in the past couple of months about whether he could go round Parliament's back, if you like, shut it out of the decision about leaving Europe with no deal. But I think he wouldn't be well advised to do that, even though Parliament is struggling to stop him. And so he's going to want to make some overtures, I think, to the more moderate part of his party, but we don't know yet.
Tom Swarbrick, do you think Parliament can stop him if he wants a not if he wants a no deal, but if he feels that is his only option, do you think Parliament can stop him?
I think that's a very open question at the moment, which is probably why the high wire act of balancing both sides of the debate, or the many sides of the debate, via the cabinet is one way of trying to stay on the high wire that Boris Johnson is going to have to walk on over the coming months. So I think actually quite a lot of the potential cabinet ministers are wandering around here. There's Jacob Rees-Mogg down there somewhere, maybe he's in line for a job. Michael Fallon's been touring the TV studios, he might be back in time for a job for cabinet. So that's going to be very important. The speech on the steps of Number 10 was for Theresa May a moment to show the country that she understood the reasons for leaving and that she prioritised those people as part of her government and her mission for government. And it brought her quite a lot of broad support for quite a long period of time. She had quite a long honeymoon. Boris Johnson could do the same tomorrow, depending on the tone and the context of the speech that he gives.
Okay, do you agree with that, Bronwyn? Can he buy himself a kind of honeymoon?
I think he's going to have a honeymoon anyway, but I think what he needs to be doing is reaching out to the country, trying to indicate what the flavour of his government would be and what its appeal to the whole country would be, just in case there is a general election. And that is very possibly going to be forced on him.
But we're already seeing this sort of new group of rebels. We had the ERG, they're now effectively in some ways you could say in power, and now the rebels are Philip Hammond and his mates.
Well, they are, and we've had Dominic Grieve today saying that he might leave the Conservative Party if it starts heading for no deal. So I think the crucial question is what Boris Johnson is going to say about the course of Brexit that he's going to take, and whether or not he seems to be going for no deal.
But he's already said, he said again and again in the campaign, do or die.
He needs to say, I think he needs to be clearer now, though, about whether, how serious he is going to be about trying to get a deal from the European Union, and whether, where the areas of compromise are going to be. Rhetoric, as you're campaigning for the top job, is one thing. We now actually need to know what his plan is.
I think all of that means that we are, in all likelihood, heading for a general election. And it's something that Boris Johnson may well relish. You've got Jeremy Corbyn in power still in the Labour Party. There are clearly issues to to press him on if you are campaigning against him. He is perhaps clearing the decks ahead of a general election by talking about education funding, social care as the big things that are going to that he's going to spend his energy and time trying to deal with whilst in number 10. Maybe that clears a path through.
And a general election when?
Well, you've got a period of time towards the end of September where you have enough time to hold a general election, get the result, and then go out on October the 31st. It's quick. It would have to happen very quickly. He would probably have to make the decision to make that happen very quickly unless he has it forced on him. But it doesn't feel like, with Parliament with the way it is, that he can either get through a no deal or actually do enough to the current deal to pass muster with the ERG.
But would he and the Conservative Party not fear the Brexit Party if they had?
They would certainly fear the Brexit Party. They would certainly fear Labour, even though Labour would be put on the spot and really have to come up with what its position on Brexit was. But Boris Johnson would also have to say what his position on Brexit was. And it's all very well saying, well, I'll try and do a deal and then I'll go for no deal if not. But we'd be just weeks ahead of it, away from the deadline at that point. And I think the country would want to know a bit more about this crucial thing.
So do you agree with Tom that we're looking at a possible September general election?
Only if it is really forced on him by the rebels in the next few weeks. Otherwise, my sense is he might try to avoid that.
Yes, and he's
waited a long time for this moment.
Yeah, so he doesn't want to throw it away.
To have it whisked away from him in just weeks would be.
And in a way, Gordon Brown was in a sort of similar position, talking about the dilemma of whether to go for an early snap election.
So was Theresa May, and she decided, and she went for it, and it didn't go very well. But the idea that the fact of calling the election wasn't the problem. The problem was how the election campaign was carried out. The same may be true of Boris Johnson, it may not. I think the fact is everything is up in the air now. A lot of power is concentrated on Boris Johnson and what decisions he makes in the coming days and how he manages that high wire act.
I suppose British politics now are so volatile and so unpredictable, it's very difficult for any party leader to make any sort of decision like that, isn't it?
Well, I think Boris Johnson is going to want to get a feel for what he might get from Brussels, unless he's being really cynical and has no intention of having those talks. But he spent time in Brussels, even though a lot of that was poking fun at the EU. I think he's want to go there, and there have been some noises about the kind of areas that there might be compromise in. So I think he's going to want to, have those talks first.
All right. Bronwyn Maddox, Tom, as well. Thank you very much indeed, Tom Swarbrick. That is the latest from here at Westminster. Boris Johnson, we think, is still at Conservative Party headquarters, talking to party staff there just around the corner. But we'll be back with much more from Westminster a little bit later on. Now, though, back to Rebecca in the studio.
Thanks, Ben. And in a moment, we'll have all the business news. First, though, here are the headlines on BBC News. Boris Johnson is elected as the new Conservative leader and will become the next UK Prime Minister. Mr Johnson has promised to deliver Brexit by October the 31st, saying it's do or die. The new EU Commission President warns of challenging times ahead. And a heatwave is spreading across the UK, with temperatures expected to climb to well over 30 degrees Celsius this week.
Afternoon, I'm Jamie Robertson. Business news now. Huawei has cut more than 600 jobs in the US at its research unit FutureWay. The telecoms giant said the job cuts were due to the curtailment of business operations caused by the US. Now, this is after Washington put the Chinese firm on a trade blacklist, which restricts its ability to trade with US firms. Unions have called on employers to allow staff to work flexibly and have a relaxed dress code during this week's UK heatwave. The TUC said people should be allowed to travel at different times or work from home, wear more casual clothing, adding that it was in their interest to provide staff with a cool and comfortable work environment. Supermarket sales have fallen for the first time in 3 years. Now, it was largely due to a record splurge by shoppers last year on traditional summer favourites, ice cream, alcohol, especially during the Men's Football World Cup. Sales over the last 3 months fell by 0.5% compared to the same period last year. So, if you want an investor's reaction to the election of Boris Johnson to the post of Prime Minister, well, I'm afraid the feeling's fairly mixed. The pound fell as soon as the announcement happened, fell a bit more and then started to climb back again. None of these movements are really particularly huge. Stock market, that also climbed after Mr Johnson was made leader of the Conservative Party. Much of that movement driven by the big exporters, Unilever, BP, Shell, so on, who profit, of course, from a falling currency because they make their profits in foreign exchange. You've also got to remember the announcement was hardly unexpected, so you wouldn't perhaps expect any dramatic reaction. But we can look at this in a bit more detail and about what we expect in the coming weeks. Russ Moulders, Investment Director at AJ Bell, joins me now. Would you agree with that sort of assessment? I mean, it was all rather expected. We saw a little bit of down, a little bit of up. It hasn't gone very far, has it?
No, you've stolen all my lines, Jamie,
No,
so I'm
sorry.
a little bit stuck for something to say now. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the pound's down a little bit against the dollar, up a little bit against the euro. Mr Johnson was widely expected to win. As you say, the secret now is how long does he get in terms of his term as Prime Minister? Does he call a general election, take a gamble? And then what policies does he start to actually institute, particularly with regard to Brexit?
Now, without making any comment about Mr Johnson at all, would any sane human being invest in such a degree of uncertainty in this market?
I guess the one thing that you can say is that you can have cheap stocks and good news, just not both at the same time. So given that in the UK right now there's a lot of confusion, not necessarily bad news, but certainly confusion, you may end up with a situation whereby, as a result, UK stocks look cheap on a profits and a dividend yield basis. So if you're feeling particularly brave, you might actually view it as an opportunity.
Do you think stocks are cheap at the moment?
I think on a dividend yield basis, definitely.
You mean this is the return you're getting, the interest you're getting on your investments in the stock market?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like an interest rate paid on the share price, basically, as a reward for your support as a shareholder. That right now is between 4 and 4.5%. That compares to what? 1% in the bank if you're lucky. The government bond yield of less than that. So on a relative basis, you could argue that you're actually getting a decent return on your money in shares, with the caveat there's obviously much more capital at risk.
And of course, with all these big companies, particularly on the FTSE, all of them investing overseas, they've got a lot of their operations overseas. If we have a no-deal Brexit, one would presume the pound would collapse, and you'd make a lot of money, actually, wouldn't you? Because those stocks would go up, they'd get a huge dividend coming back.
In the short term, that could definitely help, and I think sterling will act as a shock absorber. And if you look at the last really big sort of European shock related to the UK economy with Black Wednesday back in 1992, the pound fell very sharply. That helped to stoke an export boom, get the UK economy out of recession, and the pound had actually recaptured all of the ground that it lost within 18 to 24 months. So the pound could act as a very, very useful buffer if a no-deal Brexit does lead to some economic dislocation. We don't know whether it will or whether it won't.
OK, look, from an investor's point of view, what would the ideal situation be? What would you really like to happen in the next, say, let's say through till October the 31st?
I think we'd like to know just what the situation is, whether we have a deal, a no deal. If we have a deal, what type of deal? Because then investors can make a rational decision as to whether UK stocks really are cheap or not, because then they know what they're dealing with. And once we know what we're dealing with, we hopefully can stop using the awful word uncertainty that everybody's fed up of.
Russ, really good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
From AJ Bell. Just a few other business stories that we've been following. First, Fever Tree. That's a company that makes those tonics, drinks, mixes and so on. Its reported sales growth is slipping, and it's largely due to bad weather in the first half of this year, or rather, not so good weather. Shareholders in Fever Tree actually are used to pretty stellar growth. The fact that in the first 6 months, sales still grew 5%, revenues rose 13%, but even so, the shares are down 12%. More people flying out and into Heathrow, 1.8% more, almost 39 million people. It's measured over the first 6 months of this year against the same period a year ago. Now, the airport says it's shaping up actually for another strong year, but there are some strikes on the horizon. Unite announcing a two-day strikes over pay during the holiday period. And you've heard about the Northern Powerhouse. Well, councils of the cities of Bristol, Cardiff and Newport, they say they want a Great Western one as well. The area would stretch from Swansea in the west, Swindon and Bath in the east, and as far north as Tewkesbury, and it will boost industry and improve transport links, so they say. Quick look at the markets before we go. There we got the FTSE, as I said, looking pretty strong, up 50, not as high as it was. It was up about 80 points earlier. Pound against the dollar, 124, sort of in the middle of its trading range, not a huge change. The Dow just up 1/3 of 1%, and the pound against the euro, 111. Again, it climbed a little bit, but it's not going anywhere very seriously at the moment. But that is all the business news for the moment. I'll be back in an hour's time.
Jamie, thank you very much indeed. We're live here at Westminster, digesting all the reaction to the news that Boris Johnson has become the new Conservative Party leader and tomorrow will become the new Prime Minister. of the United Kingdom. Well, I'm joined here to talk about that with the Conservative MP and prominent Brexiteer, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
The result you were expecting?
Yes, indeed. It was in line with the surveys done by Conservative Home and YouGov, so a very good result for Boris, a very strong mandate from Conservative members, which I'm sure Conservative MPs will take into account.
So now he has to start work, well, I think he's already started work on deciding who's going to be in his cabinet and in his government. What sort of government should it be? Should he be giving jobs across the ideological spectrum of the Conservative Party, or should this be a narrow, purist, ideological Brexiteer sort of cabinet?
Well, I think Boris is very wise and has already made it clear his broad outline, and that is people must accept that we are leaving on the 31st of October, but what people said in 2016 is not going to determine their position. So somebody like Amber Rudd, who's made it clear that she has accepted the result, is probably in a very strong position, but that people who are trying to overturn the referendum result and don't want to commit to leaving on the 31st of October will probably not be able to serve Boris.
So they have to sign up to a possible no deal?
Well, they have to sign up to collective responsibility, which is a basic constitutional point that has been shattered in the last couple of years to the great disadvantage of good government. And I think for Boris to set it out clearly that he is interested in the constitutional conventions and good government is very wise.
Are you expecting a job in the cabinet?
No, I'm not expecting anything. It's not about me, it's about can we deliver Brexit and will Boris succeed, and I have confidence that he will.
Will you take a job if offered?
I'll do anything he wants me to do.
OK. What about, you talked about the lack of cabinet collective responsibility. What about this new group of rebels we're potentially going to have? A lot of people say you have been the rebels, now effectively you're in power, your man is in power, your man is in Downing Street, but now Philip Hammond and his cohorts are going to be the new rebels in your place.
Well, in terms of my own role in the ERG, what we were doing was standing up for what 17.4 million people voted for and what was said in the Conservative Party manifesto. That was to say that we should leave and that we should leave with or without a deal. So we were backing Conservative Party policy.
Well, you were trying to bring down the Prime Minister.
Well, only when she came forward with a withdrawal agreement that didn't meet the promises she'd previously made, yes. But that was at a point at which we had a withdrawal agreement that wasn't properly taking us out of the European Union and had a disgraceful Irish backstop. So it's not really rebellious to back Tory principles. To go against a mandate of 17.4 million people and a general election seems to me an eccentric position to take up.
What sort of deal do you think Boris Johnson might be able to get with the European Union, where Theresa May failed to get a deal that she could get through this Parliament? Do you think that Boris Johnson can do that?
Well, I think there's a fundamental difference in approach, that Boris's starting point is that leaving the European Union is a great opportunity and one from which this country can benefit. Theresa May's starting point as a Remainer was that it was a problem to be managed, and therefore how you approach the negotiation is different. And Boris recognises that no deal, leaving without an agreement, is a very strong negotiating card because the EU then doesn't get £39 billion and so on. And therefore he will be negotiating from a position of much greater strength than Theresa May, who was never willing to play that card.
Do you think when he has talked about we're leaving on October the 31st, do or die, come what may, was that campaign rhetoric? Or does he really, really mean that?
I think when he said if we kick the can, we kick the bucket, he meant it. The Conservative Party doesn't get the country out on the 31st of October. We will lose to the Brexit Party. If the Conservative Party loses to the Brexit Party, we get Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister, and that would be a disaster for the United Kingdom.
But can you get a no-deal Brexit if it comes to that through this place, through Parliament?
It's already been passed through Parliament twice, both in the Article 50 Act and the Withdrawal Act. And there are a number of MPs who keep on saying, oh, Parliament will never agree to no deal, who voted for the Article 50 Act and the Withdrawal Act. So either they don't understand what they vote for and just go through the division lobbies like sheep, or else they're very forgetful. The law, the default, is that we leave on the 31st of October. Parliament can only change that by changing the law. It can't do it by mere motion.
But they may be able to find a mechanism, and if they can find a mechanism, it is said there may be up to 50 Conservative MPs who would, however you want to call it, rebel against Boris Johnson and his government.
Well, you say a mechanism. There are only two ways of stopping us leaving on the 31st of October. One is to change the government, the other is to change the law. Changing the law isn't a mechanism, it is a detailed process. And changing the government requires putting Jeremy Corbyn in. Not many Conservatives, well, nobody who calls himself or herself a Conservative can want to see Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister.
Why is Jeremy Corbyn automatically going to be... Boris Johnson said that he's the man who can defeat Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, you're saying how do you stop Brexit? The only way to do that would be to change the government.
But if you had an election, are you not confident that you could beat the Labour Party?
Oh, well, the way to stop Brexit isn't via an election, it's by a change of government without an election. I think the people who want to stop Brexit aren't interested in having any more votes. They're against votes because they lose them. What they want to do is do it by subterfuge. And all this talk about rejecting no deal is code for saying they don't want Brexit at all. And people like me must make it clear what they're trying to do.
But the reality could be, you've got to accept it as a possibility, that Parliament will stop a no deal and therefore you're forced into an election.
I'm sorry to be boring and repeat what I said, but Parliament's already passed the laws that make leaving without a deal the default position. And the people who are saying they don't want no deal actually...
You don't think there's any possibility that Parliament could stop
unless they bring down the government or change the law. Those are the two ways of doing it, but both of those seem very difficult to achieve.
All right, Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much indeed for your time. All right, let's get a look at the weather. We know it's really, really hot where we are here at Westminster, but Darren Bett's got the forecast for the whole country.
Hello there. The heat is really building now. Today's a hotter day than it was yesterday, and this week could turn out to be a record breaker as well. Now, earlier on, we do have some cloud around, particularly in Scotland, but that is breaking up. Most places seeing blue skies and high temperatures as well. Particularly across England and Wales, widely, at least inland, 30 degrees plus, with a peak of around 35 in the southeast of England, around the London area. But that heat and humidity is going to spark some torrential, thundery downpours. They'll probably start to arrive across the Channel Islands through this evening, moving northwards up towards the West Country, into Wales, through the Midlands, not far away from the southeast of England and East Anglia, and then those thundery downpours pushing up overnight across northern England, into Northern Ireland, particularly up towards Scotland later on. Some hail, some thunder, some gusty winds. There may well be some flash flooding from the torrential downpours. A really noisy night and a very warm and sticky night as well, particularly where it's likely to stay dry in the southeast corner of England. Very uncomfortable indeed. Still some wet weather around first thing and perhaps into the early rush hour, but it is moving very quickly northwards, that very heavy and thundery rain. So drying off in most places. A few residual showers left in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but on the whole the sunshine and dry weather returns. Probably not quite as hot across eastern parts of England, but this is where we'll see the highest temperatures. We're getting all the heat though because the jet stream is changing position. It's buckling, it's diving to the west of the UK. It allows high pressure to develop to the east, changing the wind flow. The wind, our air coming all the way up from North Africa in across Europe and lifting those temperatures, with the peak of the heat expected to be on Thursday. Sunny start, a very warm start and muggy start too. Could get a few storms running across Wales up towards northwest England and Scotland later on, but the real focus of the heat, that is going to be across the Midlands and eastern England and in the southeast of England. This is where we could find the temperatures up to around 37, possibly even 38 degrees. And that would break the record, of course. The July record for the UK is 36.7. That was set just a few years ago. By the time we get to Friday, fresher Atlantic air should be sweeping in. Most places will be dry with some sunshine, and this time the highest temperature is 27 or 28 Celsius.
This is BBC News. It's 4 o'clock. I'm Ben Brown, live at Westminster. Our headlines. Boris Johnson is elected as the new Conservative Party leader and will become Britain's next Prime Minister. He beat Jeremy Hunt in a poll of Tory members, winning almost 2/3 of the vote.
Deliver Brexit, unite the country and defeat Jeremy Corbyn. And that is what we're going to do.
Mr Johnson has promised to deliver Brexit by October the 31st, saying it's do or die. The new EU Commission President warns of challenging times ahead. And President Trump has already congratulated Mr Johnson, saying he will be great.
I'm Rebecca Jones. The other main headline at 4. A heatwave is spreading across the UK, with temperatures expected to climb to well over 30 degrees Celsius this week.
Hello, good afternoon from Westminster. So now we know, and in the end there was no great surprise. Boris Johnson was always favourite to win, and now he has been voted in as the new Conservative Party leader. He will officially take over as UK Prime Minister tomorrow. That's after meeting with the Queen at Buckingham Palace. Well, Boris Johnson gained around double the votes that Jeremy Hunt did from Conservative Party members. In his victory speech, Mr Johnson promised to unite the country and to deliver Brexit by the deadline of the 31st of October. But he has already seen some ministerial resignations, and there could be more, as several cabinet members have already said they cannot support his do-or-die pledge to leave the EU. Ian Watson, our political correspondent, has our first report.
He walked in first but finished second. Jeremy Hunt was decisively defeated by Boris Johnson. For many, the former Foreign Secretary was the face of Brexit, the mop-topped figurehead of Vote Leave. And that probably appealed to the 2/3 of Conservative members who gave them their support. He said he'd take Britain out of the EU by the end of October, and his acceptance speech was a cocktail of optimism and humour with only the slightest dash of detail.
And we know the mantra of the campaign that has just gone by. In case you've forgotten it, you probably have. It's always a couple of, it is deliver Brexit, unite the country and defeat Jeremy Corbyn. And that is what we're going to do. And I know some wag has already pointed out that deliver, unite and defeat was not the perfect acronym for an election campaign, since unfortunately it spells dud. But they forgot the final E, my friends. E for energise.
He seems to have already united his family, though some have very different views on Brexit. But he romped through some of his other policy ambitions too.
And we are once again going to believe in ourselves and what we can achieve. And like some slumbering giant, we are going to rise and ping off the guy ropes of self-doubt and negativity with better education, better infrastructure, more police, fantastic full fibre broadband sprouting in every household.
Theresa May promised to support Boris Johnson from the backbenches, but not everyone in the Conservative Party is going to be so generous. The announcement of the new Conservative leader was made here, but the real challenges begin tomorrow when he moves just round the corner into Downing Street. Boris Johnson has said that he'll take us off the hamster wheel of doom, as he calls it, and get Britain out of the European Union by the end of October. If he doesn't do that, his time in Downing Street may be limited. If he does do that, but without a deal, he'll be facing not just the opposition, but the unofficial opposition, senior members of Theresa May's government who are prepared to rebel against him. Another former Foreign Secretary believes Boris Johnson could face some significant hurdles here in Parliament.
There are at least, probably in my estimation, up to 50 Tory MPs who will not support no deal. And as long as he seems to be talking in that sort of language, he will lose every vote in the House of Commons.
This is one minister who won't serve under Boris Johnson. David Gauke's colleagues who oppose no deal have been dubbed the Gawkward Squad.
There is a clear majority in the House of Commons that doesn't want to leave the EU without a deal. I think that will become very clear in the autumn. That'll be underlined in the autumn. I think there may well be ways in which Parliament finds an ability to make it clear what it thinks, and that is binding upon the new Prime Minister.
And the Education Minister, Anne Milton, resigned today. She was concerned that Britain could leave the EU with no deal.
I wish the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, well in his negotiations with the EU, but I have always had grave concerns about leaving the EU without a deal in place.
But one prominent Boris Johnson supporter was rather looking down on those who choose to criticise him.
There is no scope now for self-indulgence and individual MPs just expressing their own views. For the Conservative Party to deliver for our country, we have to unite, we have to come together.
How are you feeling, Mr Hunt?
Boris Johnson's opponent admitted that he was disappointed and called for unity. And this was his diagnosis for his failure to win.
This was always going to be uphill for us because I was someone who voted Remain. We have a Prime Minister who voted Remain, and I think lots of Conservative Party members felt that this was a moment when you just had to have someone who voted for Brexit in the referendum. And that was, in retrospect, that was a hurdle we were never able to overcome.
The future's uncertain for Larry the Downing Street cat, and indeed for the country. The new Prime Minister has a wafer-thin majority, even with Northern Ireland's DUP on side. Boris Johnson moves in here tomorrow. It is not clear how long his tenure will last. Ian Watson, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's get the latest from our chief political correspondent, Vicki Young, who's in the Houses of Parliament. And Vicki, what's been the reaction generally to the news that Boris Johnson's got this, the leadership? I mean, he was always expected to, of course, but 66% of the party membership. Is that a resounding majority that gives him a mandate from the party?
I mean, it does, but it is a limited mandate, isn't it? It's, of course, the electorate were just the Conservative Party, so it helps him to some extent, but of course, the much broader support that he's going to need from the country is still, up for grabs, isn't it? And I think, the party has gone for him because they think he's a winner. They hope he's a winner. They might expect that there could be a general election. They think that he might be able to beat Jeremy Corbyn. So that is why the party has got behind him. But he has still got the issue of the numbers in the House of Commons and how he gets a Brexit deal through, if that's what he wants to do. He says he does want to get some kind of new deal, and he would much prefer that to leaving without a deal. Now, I think as he pursues that, he will have the support of most of his MPs, even those who didn't campaign for him, who are pretty much against his leadership, and some of whom are resigning because they don't want to serve under him. I think he will have their backing as long as he's pursuing a deal. The problem for him comes if we get to October and he's then heading to a no-deal scenario. And, people who have spoken to him in the last few days, I've just spoken to a cabinet minister who saw him yesterday, to a former cabinet minister who saw him last week. They are not clear from talking to him in private what his plan is, and today's speech, I suppose, was typical of that. It was exuberant, it was optimistic, it was calling for people to come together, but there was no detail, and that is still what a lot of MPs feel. They feel that they're in the dark about what happens if, for example, Parliament stops no deal in some way. What would Boris Johnson do then? And they don't really have an answer to that.
Vicki, thank you very much indeed. Vicki Young there, our chief political correspondent, and we can talk now to the leader of the independent group for Change, MP Anna Soubry. Thank you very much for being with us. What is your reaction to the news that Boris Johnson has, as expected, got the leadership?
Oh, I think this is very bad news for our country. And it's a bleak day for British politics. I mean, he's been elected on the basis that he is determined that we are going to leave the European Union on October the 31st. He doesn't have a plan for that. And he believes in our crashing out without a deal, which is not what we were promised and is not in our country's interests, and I do not believe has the support of the vast majority of people of this country. But it does show you the shift in the Conservative Party to the right, because he clearly has the backing of the majority of members of the Conservative Party, but that's no mandate. That is not a mandate. 92,000 people determining our country's future and our future for our children.
Although that is the way that political party leaders are elected.
Well,
by their party members.
Yes, but it's the platform upon which he has stood, and it is the fact that in the face of this national crisis we find ourselves now facing this cliff edge, this crash out, which is not what we were promised and is not in the country's interest. And it's now up to everybody to stand up for their constituents in the country, put their constituents' jobs first, not their own jobs, and make sure that we do not leave the European Union in that way.
Can Parliament stop it? Can Parliament stop a no-deal exit?
Of course we can.
How?
Well, we proved it last week. We are not going to allow the Parliament to be prorogued in any way. And if where there's a will, there's a way. And if we so choose, and we can do it now, we've shown we've got the numbers, and every time no deals come before the House, the majority has voted against no deal.
But what would be the mechanism for stopping it?
There are a variety of mechanisms, and some of them I'm not going, if I may say, going to discuss.
Well, because we were just talking to Jacob Rees-Mogg. He said you can't do it. You'd have to legislate.
Oh, well, if he says it, then it must be true. Well, of course we can legislate. There's all manner of ways. The truth is, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg are now running this country. They're now running the Conservative Party. That's what Boris's election has shown, because he's now in hock to them. So the real question is, how is Boris going to deliver this? And of course he can't deliver it. So what's he going to do, having made this promise? I mean, he is very good at changing his mind. I think his mendacity runs throughout him. He'll say anything to curry favour and win a vote. But what's he going to do? He's either going to have a general election, which he won't do because he knows he can't win it. He doesn't want to be the shortest-termed Prime Minister ever. I think there's a good chance he's going to have to take it back to the people and have that people's vote. And that's what people now need.
You seriously think Boris Johnson would have another referendum?
Oh, this is a man who wrote one article in favour of Remain, one article in favour of Leave, and then decided which was in his best personal interest, and it was Leave. If he can do things like that, if he can vote for Mrs May's deal. He's voted for the Irish backstop. Nobody ever asks him this. He voted for it. And now he says it was an abomination, a constitutional abomination. It was wrong, it was awful, and he's going to do something different. Why don't people ask him why he went and voted for it if it's so terrible? But in any event, this is the mendacity that runs through him. He can change his mind in any way. So if he wants to change his mind and have this final say, taking it back to the British people, which is the only way forward in my view, then I'd be very happy with that change of mind.
Do you think a general election is, we were talking to some commentators earlier who thought a general election in September, because if this place Parliament does stop a no-deal Brexit, he won't have any other choice.
But if he goes to the British people with a Conservative Party on the basis of no deal, he will fracture the Conservative Party and they really will be utterly unelectable. Look, history tells us loud and clear that you win in this country, whether it's the way that Tony Blair took the oil tanker of the Labour Party and turned it round back into the centre ground, whether it was David Cameron, the way he turned and changed the Conservative Party into the centre ground to make it electable. That's how you win in British politics, in that centre ground. That's why I left the Tory party, because the Tories had abandoned the centre ground. That's why I formed this with others, this new party, this new way of doing politics, rejecting the extremes, because we've got to do our politics differently, and we also need to get back into the centre ground, and the Tories have abandoned that. And on that basis, the British people will not vote for a Conservative or give them the majority that he would need. So I can't see him going into a general election, and the only way in that event out of the impasse is to take it back to the British people with the final say, a people's vote. Now we know what Brexit looks like.
Let me just ask you briefly, Anna Soubry, it's hot here, it's quite noisy, but this is the first time you've been doing interviews out here on College Green since you were abused and harassed earlier on this year. Do you think the atmosphere has perhaps calmed down a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I know the Remain guys are always a bit shouty, but, you know, they're harmless. And actually, if you ask them to be quiet, then they will. And I'm sorry about the bad language, and I shall go and speak to them about that. But in all seriousness, I think what's happened is that the Metropolitan Police, and I pay full tribute to them because they did a splendid job in the prosecution of somebody last week. He pleaded guilty, accepting he'd done something wrong, and he got a suspended prison sentence yesterday. I think the Met realised that it was unacceptable for not just me, but I mean Sammy Wilson is standing over here, another member of Parliament. It was unacceptable that members of Parliament, like anybody else, couldn't go about their lawful business. There were people who work in Parliament who were being spat at, who were being abused. You couldn't do your job, frankly. Your crew couldn't do their job because of the unacceptable levels of noise and the abuse. So I think the Met they're doing their job. And we're all grateful for that, because I certainly feel safe, and I will carry on doing what I believe is right. Well, that's what we all must do.
We're very grateful to you for coming here and talking to us this afternoon.
No, it's good to see you guys back here as well, because I think in truth you all found it really difficult as well.
Okay.
I mean, some of you were terribly abused. Anyway, that's good news for democracy. And this is what we've got to do. We've got to get back to the way of doing things properly and not being bullied and harassed by people who I don't think have our country's interests at heart.
Good to talk to you, Anna Soubry. Thank you very much indeed. Well, as Anna Soubry was just mentioning, Sammy Wilson is standing by, waiting to talk to us while he gets his microphone ready. I'll just remind you that Boris Johnson is the new leader of the Conservative Party. He won with 66% of the Conservative Party membership. 87% was the turnout of the party membership. So it wasn't the entire party membership that voted, but it was a pretty large number of them. And Boris Johnson got 66%. And that's the windows of the 1922 committee of the Conservative Party backbenchers there at Westminster, in the Palace, Westminster. Let's talk then to Sammy Wilson, who's joined me now. Sammy Wilson, thanks very much for being with us. I think we had a statement from Arlene Foster actually this afternoon saying she's talked to Boris Johnson since he got the job, since he got the leadership.
Yeah.
She has congratulated him and has indicated she wishes to work with Boris and to see through the confidence and supply arrangement that we have with the Conservative Party so that it can fulfil its 5-year mandate, which it gained at the last election.
So you're going to keep propping up this government?
We will keep supporting them so long as, and it's not unconditional support, of course, so long as they continue to support the union, then we will continue to support them.
What happens next, do you think, in terms of what Boris Johnson does with the EU negotiations? Do you think he can get a deal from the EU? Do you think the EU will renegotiate, go back on what they've said and actually sit down and renegotiate the withdrawal agreement?
Well, I think if he stands by the promises which he has made, that first of all, he is not going to accept a union-breaking and referendum-denying deal, then, and he insists that we will leave on the 31st of October as the law of the land says we will, then I think there's every chance of getting the EU to rethink their position, because don't forget, the EU has adopted the position that they have to date because they thought they had a weak, vacillating, wavering government that gave in to every demand, every deadline that they made, and that, that's the union's negotiating position, and that's their approach to things. Faced with someone who has got a bit more steel in his negotiating stance, I believe that they will understand that the need for a deal is as important to the European Union as it is to the United Kingdom.
So what sort of concessions are you expecting?
Well, I think that first of all, the main concession is that there is no need for the backstop arrangements. The backstop arrangements, don't forget, were designed by the EU to ensure that the United Kingdom as a whole, although they were focused in on the Irish border, they were designed to do one thing, and that was to keep the United Kingdom in the customs union and the single market by creating a problem, an illusionary problem.
The aim of the backstop, as you know, is to avoid a return to a hard Irish border and a return to possible bloodshed.
Well, first of all, there'll be no return to bloodshed.
People say that if you had a hard border with checkpoints and all of the rest of it, and border posts, you could then have targets that could then become the source of new violence and bloodshed.
You see, you are putting a question to me about a situation which is never going to arise. Even the Irish government this week has indicated that in the event of a no deal, they'll be having no checkpoints along the border, nothing for terrorists to attack. So, this was an illusionary problem all along anyhow. If it comes to checking trade across the border, we have the mechanism for doing that already. We collect taxes across the border. We check for animal health across the border. We check for regulatory compliance across the border at present. We have searches by the police and by the customs officials where there's intelligence-led information which would indicate that there's illegal goods being transported across the border anyhow. So, all of the things which are needed to be done if the United Kingdom becomes a third country, the means to do that are already in place and could already be implemented.
We'll have to leave it there. Sammy Wilson from the DP, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for being with us here at Westminster. And European leaders have been swift to congratulate Boris Johnson, among them the European Commission's President, Ursula von der Leyen, who was recently elected herself. Let's have a listen to what she had to say.
First of all, congratulations to Boris Johnson to be nominated as Prime Minister. And I'm looking forward to have a good working relation with him. There are many different and difficult issues to tackle together. We have challenging times ahead of us. I think it is very important to build up a strong and a good working relation, because we have the duty to deliver something which is good for people in Europe and in the United Kingdom. So I'm looking forward to working with him. Thank you.
Ursula von der Leyen speaking a little earlier. Now I'm going to talk to Jonathan Stock, who's a former special advisor to Theresa May, and you were there in Downing Street when power changed over last time round, I think, between David Cameron and Theresa May. Just talk us through the theatre of what will happen tomorrow.
Of course. So this sort of transition of power, whether it's between two prime ministers of the same party or of different parties, very much set in its ways in some respects. We'll obviously see some departing remarks from the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, following her last appearance at PMQs on the steps of Downing Street before she heads off to the Queen, and then thereafter she makes her own arrangements there off, and then Boris Johnson will travel to see the Queen and return to Downing Street to make his own remarks, starting his premiership and occupation of the famous front door, I suppose.
What are the logistics in terms of sort of moving stuff out, moving stuff in?
Of course, if you were there a fly on the wall, you would see a huge amount of activity. I can't expect that, particularly given we've had 24 hours notice on this occasion, that it's perhaps not as swift as a change of government after a general election, but certainly in that time there's offices to be cleaned, to be reallocated. I'm sure a number of the special advisors and political staff who'll be moving out may already pack their boxes, but in practice there's a whole new team, a whole new Prime Minister that will want to come in and make his mark on Downing Street, and as I mentioned, you know, a whole team that will be requiring office space, that will be requiring mobile phones, requiring computer access and emails in order to get cracking straight away.
Yeah, that must be quite hard, mustn't it, to go in en masse and just start straight away. Has there been a sort of transition of people been going in and out to get an idea of how it will be?
There's no formal transition, say, as per the United States. In practice, there will have been some discreet conversations happening between the civil service and potentially Mr. Johnson and some of his senior advisors in terms of how they expect the sort of organogram to look, I suppose, who's got decision-making rights on his behalf in terms of hiring and firing and that sort of thing. But in practice, you know, it is a bit of an emotional sort of upset, I suppose.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how emotional is it for those who are leaving? I mean, it must be a bit of a wrench.
I'm lucky enough not to have left Downing Street in these circumstances, but having spoken to some former colleagues, it's of course a very sort of emotional time. I think the sort of heightened emotion of working in government anyway, and you sort of hit a wall, I suppose, of enforced decompression, which I can't imagine is necessarily too much fun. But I suspect a lot of them will be very proud of the work that they've achieved, even if the circumstances have made that particularly challenging. Of course, a number of them might be looking for roles to continue in government, be that in Mr. Johnson's Downing Street or in roles elsewhere. But a number of them, I suspect, will have called time and kind of will be pleased of however long they've spent working with Theresa May, and will leave with her.
And those coming in, I suppose it's quite an exuberant time. Finally, you're working in the heart of power in number 10 Downing Street.
Of course, it's certainly very exciting. I remember my experiences from Theresa May's arrival. It's filled with energy. The very same permanent staff who stay in Downing Street will have clapped out the departing Prime Minister, Theresa May, tomorrow. And shortly after, on Mr. Johnson's arrival, following his speech on the steps, they'll clap them in. And you, as part of that team that may have been involved in securing the Premier's role there, will obviously receive that welcome very warmly and very friendly. And I think it's a tribute to the professionalism of those staff who have to churn through their own emotions and their own attachments to the previous administration and be ready to serve this new one with the same energy that they faced the last.
Well, we'll see what happens tomorrow, but thank you very much for that insight into the workings of number 10. Jonathan Stock there, former number 10 advisor. Well, let's find out now what the reaction to Boris Johnson's victory in the Tory leadership contest has been in Ireland and in Scotland. Well, in a moment we're going to speak to Lorna Gordon, who's in Glasgow. But first let's go to Keith Doyle in Dublin. Keith, what's the reaction been there?
Yes, good afternoon from a very sunny Dublin. Yes, there's been some reaction here. There's been congratulations from the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar. He congratulated Boris Johnson, but then he went on to say that he looks forward to an early engagement on Brexit, Northern Ireland and bilateral relations. Now, Ireland has always been very clear that any negotiations on Brexit, on the withdrawal agreement, were between the EU and Britain. And certainly there was no individual negotiations going on between Ireland and Britain. But clearly here there is some merit that Leo Varadkar sees in getting an early meeting in with Boris Johnson, really to hammer home that message that the backstop and the agreement, that is there to stay as far as Ireland's concerned. Simon Govney, who's the Deputy Prime Minister, the Taoiseach here, he issued a statement to say we will work constructively with Boris Johnson and his government to maintain and strengthen British-Irish relations through the challenges of Brexit. And it certainly is challenges. I mean, you remember at the weekend, Simon Govney warned on BBC TV of the dangers of a no-deal Brexit and the dangers of any incoming Prime Minister trying to tear up the withdrawal agreement. He said if they tried to do that, we're in trouble. And the trouble really is for the all-Ireland economy. The Irish government has been very clear how disastrous it feels that a no-deal Brexit would have on the all-Ireland economy. And that's really one of their key motivations for making sure that the withdrawal agreement with the backstop goes through, if Brexit goes through. Of course, the Irish government would rather Brexit didn't go through at all. Interestingly, another reaction from Bertie Ahern, the former Prime Minister, former Taoiseach here. He said on Irish radio this morning that he doesn't believe that there is, in his words, a hope in hell of the new British Prime Minister getting Brexit done by the deadline of October the 31st. Of course, he's not in government anymore, so he doesn't have to be so diplomatic, but diplomatic language coming from the Taoiseach's department behind me saying early engagement and constructive discussions. That's the message here from Dublin.
All right, Keith, thank you very much, Keith Doyle there. Let's go to Lorna Gordon then in Glasgow. And we've been hearing already from the First Minister, I think, with reaction to Boris Johnson being elected party leader and tomorrow Prime Minister.
Yes, Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, has been reacting to his win of the leadership, Conservative Party leadership contest. She congratulated him, but she warned him that he should be in no doubt about the strength with which she and others will oppose the threat of a no-deal Brexit. She also said that Mr Johnson would be unable to resist the pressure for a new referendum on Scottish independence. Of course, remember that the powers to grant that referendum lie with Westminster. She needs them to grant those powers in order for a referendum to go ahead. But the context of this is that a majority of people here in Scotland voted to remain in the EU, and there is some polling to suggest that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, support for independence would rise to around 60%. Boris Johnson didn't mention Scotland in his comments he made on winning that contest this morning, but he will be alert to the dangers. He's already said he'll add the title Minister for the Union to the Prime Minister title. He has said he will set up a union unit to stress test any policies through devolved prism, and that he will protect the Barnett formula, that funding structure for the devolved nations as well. We also anticipate him making a major speech on the United Kingdom here in Scotland within the next week or so. But there will be challenges here in Scotland for him from the political arena and from the very muted response largely from the public. And within the next hour or so, we expect a protest here in the centre of Glasgow against Boris Johnson's premiership, and that's before it's even begun.
All right, Lorna, thank you. Lorna Gordon in Glasgow and Keith Doyle, our thanks to you too in Dublin. And that's it from me for the moment, live here at Westminster. I'll hand you back to Rebecca, who's in the studio with a look at some of the day's other news. Rebecca.
And thank you. Forecasters expect temperatures to rise throughout the week, with a heat wave predicted to bring temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius over the next few days. On Thursday, it's even possible temperatures could beat the highest ever recorded in the UK, which was 38.5 Celsius, and that was set in Faversham in Kent in August 2003. Joining us now is our reporter Caroline Davis from Regent's Park. Caroline, we know it's hot. What should we all be doing?
Well, it certainly is pretty hot, and people here are out and enjoying the sunshine at the moment. You can see behind me there are some people having picnics, possibly after having finished work, coming to enjoy the sunshine. Round the corner from me is London Zoo. Now, we know that they've been keeping the lions cool there by giving them blood ice lollies, so it's not just the humans who are feeling the heat today as well. We know that also it can be very difficult in these sorts of temperatures, and there can be disruption caused. We've heard about in Oxford, one judge has sent the jury home because they were far too hot to be able to deliberate and is looking for a cooler room for tomorrow. We also have heard in Newbury that the council there are handing out cold drinks to rough sleepers who will struggle in this time of year as well in this sort of heat and temperatures. We've also heard that 3 trains are stuck on the East Coast main line. Now, that's apparently not to do with the heat, but of course incredibly uncomfortable if you are stuck on those trains in these sorts of temperatures. However, some people have been out and able to enjoy this beautiful weather, as Duncan Kennedy has been finding out in Bournemouth.
As schools break up, the fun breaks out. This is Britain's oldest seawater pool. Where you see water, you go for it.
What sort of temperatures can you take?
As hot as you like.
She's hot stuff.
It's factor 50 all the way, with temperatures nudging the late 20s. Is it hot enough for you?
It is lovely. I mean, this is almost as nice as being in Spain at the moment, isn't it? Do you have to take care of this kind of weather?
Well, I do, because I've got a lot of freckles and I've got fair skin, so I have to take care that I do put in the, factor like 30 or something like that. But otherwise, I'm just happy to be here.
So what's going on? Well, as the jet stream eases north of the United Kingdom, European and African weather is surging in behind, creating these temperatures by Thursday.
Well, we're going to tap into what's been happening across parts of Western Europe. High pressure's been in charge there. Things are very dry. The ground's dry, sunshine overhead. That's been warming things up. They're now bringing a little bit of African warmth too, and that all starts to trundle our way from here on.
In London, pavement thermals reveal the shimmering effects of the heat. It's fine for some who can cool off, but for elderly people, this can be an oppressive time.
Age UK recommends that if you have an older family member or neighbour, that you check in with them during the hot weather to make sure that they're keeping hydrated, that they're coping, wearing light clothing and keeping the blinds shut during the day to keep their home cool.
In Clacton on the east coast, the only wind was offshore. The heat here sapping people, pets and plants.
Well, this weather we absolutely soak the ground about 3 times a week, 2 to 3 times, and if we didn't do that within a week on this weather, they would all just die, and that would be the end of them. Yes, you've got to keep on them all the time.
Cross the country and you find Cardiff baking along with many others. A time for relaxation, but also responsibility. Public Health England are warning about pollution levels, along with Saharan dust that may bring some troublesome particles. After Britain's last mini heat wave in May, this really is summer's second act. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News.
Public Health England have also put out a heat health alert level 3. Now level 4 is when it's a national emergency. Level 3 is lower than that, and the advice really, of course, is to hydrate, perhaps have cool baths or showers, particularly before you go to bed, and to wear loose-fitting clothing, as well as trying to find some shade.
Caroline, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's stay with the weather because Darren Bett can bring us even more details.
Hello there. It's certainly a hot day out there for many of us. We're seeing the highest temperatures across England and Wales, widely 30 degrees plus, with the peak of the heat likely to be around the London area at around 35 degrees. Very hot, but also very humid, and that's going to lead to some thunderstorms developing overnight. Initially, some thundery downpours moving across the Channel Islands into the West Country, Wales, not far from the southeast of England and all that heat, up into the Midlands, Northern England, towards Northern Ireland and Scotland. Very few places staying dry. The rain could be torrential, accompanied by some hail and very gusty winds. It's also going to be very humid and uncomfortable night towards the southeast in particular, where it may well stay dry. But a lot of places are going to get some very wet weather overnight, a noisy night as well. It becomes drier during the morning, sunshine developing far and wide. Slight change in the wind direction means that for many western areas it won't be quite as hot as today, and even towards eastern England, where we'll see the highest temperatures, it's going to be a peak of 33 or 34.
What happens if your mom rejects you? That's gonna hit me hard.
Had I harmed my family without really knowing it? That was my thoughts.
محبة هي أساس كل شيء بالكون كله سوا.
İtikadından adımıyla vazgeçti.
What are little black girls going to think of you for protecting white supremacists?
I don't think we're going to have the same life like Dad did drinking out of the river because it's all dirty now.
Our World is a unique series of films on the BBC, offering personal insights into global events.
I believe in this place. I believe it can heal.
I'm very happy.
Our world. Stories that speak for themselves. This weekend on the BBC News Channel.
Hello, this is BBC News with me, Rebecca Jones. The headlines. Boris Johnson is elected as the new Conservative leader and will become the next UK Prime Minister. Mr Johnson has promised to deliver Brexit by October the 31st, saying it's do or die. The new EU Commission President warns of challenging times ahead. And President Trump has already congratulated Boris Johnson, saying he will be great. And a heatwave is spreading across the UK, with temperatures expected to climb over 35 degrees Celsius this week. Sport now, keeping cool over at the BBC Sports Centre. It's Will Perry. Hi there, Will.
Hello, Rebecca. Good afternoon to you. Yeah, there was a scare for Geraint Thomas on stage 16 of the Tour de France this afternoon. The defending champion crashed but recovered well on the 177-kilometre route starting and ending in Nîmes. You can see here the Welshman coming off his bike on a corner, but it didn't set him back too much. Thomas quickly caught up with the peloton and finished in the main group, which keeps him second overall behind the race leader, the Frenchman Julien Alaphilippe. The Australian Caleb Ewan has just won the stage today, stage 16, his second win on the Tour de France this year. The World Aquatics Championships in South Korea continues today. Great Britain's Adam Peaty won the gold medal in the 100 metres breaststroke yesterday after breaking his world record in the semi-final. Today, he went in the semi of the 50 metres breaststroke, winning that comfortably in 26.11 seconds, just shy of his own world record.
Tonight was about process, and I just didn't nail that process. You know, it's been a very emotional few days of racing, and yeah, I think tomorrow, to get the best out of myself, I just need to go for it instead of trying to think about it too much. I love racing, I love winning. So yeah, tomorrow, all about winning, and you know, if I get near the world record, that's a bonus.
Well, there was also a bronze medal for Britain's Duncan Scott in the 200 metres freestyle. He originally finished in joint 4th place, but was upgraded after Danas Raptis was disqualified. And there was, look at this, a bit of controversy during the medal ceremony as Scott refused to share a podium with the Chinese swimmer Sun Yang. He was banned for doping in 2014, something that the Australian Mac Horton also did on Sunday.
What Mac did in the 400 free, you know, it hit home, and you know, everyone in swimming got behind him. So you know, I think hopefully this happens for more events. On Team Mac, you know, if he can't respect our sport, then why should I respect him?
England fast bowler James Anderson has been ruled out of his side's Ashes warm-up test against Ireland at Lords, which starts tomorrow. Anderson injured a calf playing for Lancashire earlier this month. England's record test wicket taker now faces a race to be fit for the opening Ashes fixture at Edgbaston a week on Thursday. The England captain Joe Root says a convincing victory against the Irish will put them in a good position for a busy summer.
The message that's been to the squad is to play with a huge amount of pride and passion and intensity. Well, the intensity this week will set the tone for the rest of the summer. And as long as we apply ourselves in the right manner and we go into this game exactly like that, then we will give a good account of ourselves.
The Open Championship winner Shane Lowry has been talking about his joy of becoming the first Irishman to win the tournament on home soil. Lowry finished 6 shots clear at Royal Portrush on Sunday and says despite his extra preparation for the Open, his victory came as a shock.
I woke up this morning, you look over and Clara Joe sitting on my bedside locker. It's just hard to believe, really. I feel very lucky that it's happened to me. You know, I obviously there's a lot went into winning this, but I didn't know if I was ever going to achieve anything like this, and yeah, it's amazing.
And the International Olympic Committee says Tokyo is fully on track to deliver the 2020 Olympics as the city prepares to celebrate 1 year until the Games. Organisers are gearing up for a day of celebrations tomorrow as the countdown begins. Budget figures released last year put the total cost at just over £10 million, well above their original estimate of £5.6 billion. 3.2 million tickets have already been bought in the first phase of sales. Rebecca, that's all the sport for now. Azzy Farney will have more for you at 5:30.
Splendid. That's great, Will. Thanks so much. Let's head straight back to Westminster now and rejoin Ben.
Rebecca, thank you. Everybody here digesting the news that Boris Johnson will be taking over as Prime Minister from Theresa May tomorrow. He won 66% of the vote of Conservative Party members on a turnout of around 87%. Let's go to our chief political correspondent, Vicki Young, who's in the Houses of Parliament for us now with more reaction. Vicki.
Yep, and Boris Johnson obviously making that speech a little earlier after the announcement. Then he went to Conservative headquarters. He was there for a couple of hours and he's just addressed Conservative backbenchers here in the House of Commons, and a few little snippets from that from MPs who were in the room. One not a supporter saying it was classically Boris, the circus has come to town. Another MP in the room, the cloud has been lifted. Let's speak to the former Conservative Party leader Ian Duncan-Smith, who is with me now. And that sums it up, doesn't it really? I mean, he is still a divisive figure.
No, not really. Actually, I was in the room and lots of people who didn't vote for him were banging their desks in appreciation of the fact that he's now had an overwhelming result. And I mean, the general mood is really upbeat. There may be the odd person that is still a little bit bitter about the election, but I think they're very tiny in number. And they will be vanishingly small very soon. So, no, I thought the party came together and said, right, we've done this, we've made a decision. And I thought Boris was very good. You know, he kind of lifted the mood. It's what he does. He's very good at it. Makes them all feel part of a team. And, you know, he makes them laugh, which is really important sometimes.
I mean, people do talk about that a lot and how important it is, that sense of optimism, especially at the moment for the Conservative Party. But it's not enough, is it? I mean, you do need the detail, and you know the criticism of him is that he's not across the detail and actually doesn't have a plan when it comes to Brexit.
Well, that's not altogether correct. I ran his campaign, and that campaign was very clear about what he plans to do. We are going to be ready to leave, come what may, on the 31st or by the 31st of October. Now that is, first of all, the base of the whole plan. The second thing is we will engage with the European Union and we will seek an agreement with them. It won't be the withdrawal agreement that's there, because that's
in any form, even with changes.
No, but that's dead. I mean, he's made it clear, and they know that. They're not going to make major changes to it. So we need to seek an agreement that allows us both to part company, but to do so on a basis that allows our trade to flow and us to make sure there are no artificial obstacles. And that is really what the engagement is all about. A free trade arrangement, but there are plenty of scope for that. So that is a plan. In the meantime, he's got lots of policies. I mean, wants to improve and increase the police, and wants to make sure that we are the party of law and order again, and makes sure also that we help with education, get more teachers and refund the education system. And there are lots more as well. So there are lots of details.
The problem is Brexit will, of course, dominate, and the numbers in the House of Commons don't change. I mean, the Conservatives, your party, they don't really have a majority. So getting through anything that's remotely controversial is going to be very difficult, isn't it?
Yes, but let's get back to the reset and understand what happens now over the next 100 days. The law of the land is that we leave by the 31st of October. That is the law. Unless that is changed by legislation, it remains the law, and the default from that position is that if nothing changes, we leave by the 31st. So right now, you'd have to change that. And I don't believe there's a majority in Parliament to stop us leaving by the 31st. You saw the fact that they lost that vote quite recently when they said we must not leave without a deal. Lots of Labour MPs who are in leave areas said no, we're not at the end going to do it. We want a deal, but we're not going to stop us leaving by the 31st. So I think the mood has changed.
And what about those who say that they would try to stop a no-deal scenario? We know people like Philip Hammond, David Gauke, they will be resigning in order to, from the backbenches, stop that happening.
To be fair, they voted against their government, not his government, but the government of Theresa May only about 4 or 5 days ago. It's normal that you resign when you do that. They seem to have delayed it a little bit, so it's a natural resignation.
There's going to be trouble, isn't there, on the backbench?
Well, there may be.
How does he deal with that, Boris Johnson?
Well, he deals with it by leading. The fact is that Mrs. Thatcher taught us that lesson, Churchill taught us the lesson, all the great leaders of the past show that when you lead a political party and show it what the real choices are, and the real choice facing us now is if we don't leave by the 31st, the new party on the block, the Brexit party, will eat us alive. Why? Because the public is very angry that having voted, having been given that power, we haven't delivered. Lots of Labour MPs know this also to be the case. So yes, there may be concerns and anger and all the rest of it, but when it comes to the final analysis, do we want to risk a complete collapse in trust of the British political system, with not just the Conservatives but the Labour Party really reaping the nightmare of that, or do we leave and make sure our relationship with Europe is a good one thereafter. And I think that's the real game, and that's what we have to aim for.
Do you think Boris Johnson is daunted by the task he faces? After all these years wanting to be Prime Minister, he's finally going to take that job tomorrow. How do you think he's going to approach it?
Well, of course he'll be somewhat daunted by it. It is the biggest job in Britain, and it is the biggest job at the biggest crisis time that I can remember. So that's daunting. But the funny thing about Boris Johnson, I think people will come to realise, is, in a funny sort of way, he grows with the challenge. And I've noticed this over the campaign. He's fed off the enthusiasm of people, off the issues that he sees. I saw him today, and I was watching him, and it just thought to myself, do you know, compared to where he was 3 weeks ago, this is really now at last a Prime Minister that is ready to take over. And he's grown through this contest enormously. So I think the public will see someone of enthusiasm, who believes in Britain, who wants to do this, is committed to doing it, but will also take into consideration the fact the UK needs to have a really good plan, and that's where he's going, I think.
Are you expecting a job?
I have asked for nothing, I want nothing, it's up to him.
You serve if he asks?
Well, if he asks me to do something, of course, but I'm not, generally not, the slightest bit worried one way or the other.
See if your phone rings in the next 48 hours.
It's on silent.
Thank you very much indeed. It's on silent, he said. Ian Duncan Smith there with his insight into the Boris Johnson campaign.
Vicki, thank you. Well, Jeremy Corbyn, meanwhile, has been giving his reaction to the news today that Boris Johnson has won the Tory party leadership. Let's have a listen to what Mr Corbyn's had to say.
Well, he's been elected by less than 100,000 people, and he's been elected on a programme which appears to be tax write-offs for the very richest and a no-deal exit from the European Union. I think he needs to think a bit more carefully about where we're going.
Are you worried about facing him at a general election?
Not in the slightest. I'm ready for a general election at any time. The issues have to be, what direction is this country going to go in? Is it going to be more austerity, which he's supported? Is it going to be more inequality, which he's supported? Or is it going to be the Labour proposals of investment in the future and giving our young people some security and some hope?
Boris has been quite clear that he's going to attempt to push the UK out of the European Union with no deal, or prepare for the UK to leave with no deal. What's your response to that?
Leaving with no deal would be very, very damaging to medicine supplies in the NHS, to our agricultural system, to our manufacturing industry, and to our economy as a whole. And it will lead him straight down the direction of some kind of special trade deal with Donald Trump, negotiated from a very weak position, in which the primary demand of Trump and his colleagues will be access to the NHS. I think that is a disastrous prospect that he's offering us.
Would you continue to push for a second referendum or another confirmatory vote if Boris Johnson continues on his path to take the UK out of the EU with no deal?
What we said in the Labour Party is that we think the public should have an opportunity to vote between no deal or the Tory deal, if there is to be a Tory deal with the European Union, and the possibility of remaining in the EU. It's not a rerun of 2016, it's a decision to be made on the future direction of this country.
So there would be three options: the Tory deal, no deal, and remain.
If there's no deal versus remain. If there is a Tory deal versus remain.
And Labour would campaign for remain?
On those circumstances, yes.
Okay. Are you going to table a motion of no confidence against Boris Johnson?
We will table one when appropriate to do so, and tomorrow there will be Prime Minister's question time with Theresa May for the last time. I understand Boris Johnson will be making a statement to the House on Thursday and setting out his general approach, and we'll be setting out our approach of a decent investment-led society that delivers for every part of Britain and all communities.
What do you mean by appropriate time? When will that be? Will that be before recess or after?
We'll decide when that will be. It'll be an interesting surprise for all of you.
But you are guaranteeing that you will definitely be tabling?
We will do a motion of no confidence at a time of our choosing.
Jeremy Corbyn there with his reaction to the news that Boris Johnson has won the Tory party leadership. Well, let's talk more about what happens next with Chris Morris from our reality check team. And Chris, a lot of fiery rhetoric from Boris Johnson during the campaign. Do or die, we're leaving by October the 31st. What about the reality?
I think the problem is time is very, very short. So his first priority is still to leave with a deal which the EU says it refuses to renegotiate. But even if he somehow got something, he's got 100 days, including a large chunk of time when Parliament's in recess, to renegotiate something which the other side says isn't renegotiable, and then ratify it and then legislate for it. And I think most observers think that's nigh on impossible. The alternative, of course, in the do or die scenarios is to leave with no deal, and all the signs are that there is a majority in the House of Commons against leaving with no deal. So it does appear that both of those options will run fairly quickly into trouble. So then you get to the other possibilities. Do you call an early election, something he clearly said he doesn't want to do? Or would there have to be even another technical extension to the Brexit process, something which would be embarrassing for Mr Johnson, seeing as his promise to leave on the 31st of October was so very clear? So yeah, the rhetoric, I think, fired up the Tory party base, but the reality of governing is going to be very, very difficult.
Chris Morris, thank you very much indeed. That's just about it from me now from Westminster. Let's get the latest business news for you now with Jamie.
Good afternoon, I'm Jamie Robertson. In the business news now, let's start with British Airways. We've heard in the last few minutes that British Airways has failed in a bid for a temporary High Court injunction to halt industrial action by its pilots. This is in a dispute over pay. Pilots yesterday voted 93% in favour of taking industrial action, and turnout was 90%. Strikes could begin within 2 weeks, in the middle, of course, of the busy holiday season. Huawei has cut more than 600 jobs in the US at its research unit, FutureWay. The telecoms giant said the job cuts were due to the curtailment of business operations caused by the US. This is after Washington put the Chinese firm on a trade blacklist, which restricts its ability to trade with US firms. And supermarket sales have fallen for the first time in 3 years, but it was largely due to a record splurge by shoppers last year on traditional summer favourites like ice cream, alcohol, especially during the Men's Football World Cup. Sales over the last 3 months fell 0.5% compared with the same period a year ago. Now, if you want an investor's reaction to the election of Boris Johnson to the post of Prime Minister, well, feelings a little bit mixed, really. The pound, it fell as soon as the announcement happened, fell a bit more, climbed back and fell back. So it's been going all over the place. None of the movement's actually that big. The stock market, that climbed after Mr Johnson was made leader of the Conservative Party, but then since then has been losing some of that momentum. Much of the movement on the stock market, driven by the big exporters, Unilever, BP, Shell, they profit from a falling currency because they make their profits, of course, in foreign exchange, which becomes more valuable as our currency falls. I'm joined by Theo Leggett, our business reporter. Theo, from the point of view of businesses, what kind of reaction have we been getting through the afternoon?
Well, as you might expect, Jamie, all the business lobbies have been putting out their statements in response to the election of Mr Johnson as leader of the Conservative Party. Let's take the CBI for a start. On the face of it, very friendly, very positive. Many congratulations to Boris Johnson, but there's a pointed message here as well. On Brexit, the new Prime Minister, it says, must not underestimate the benefits of a good deal with the European Union. It'll unlock new investment and confidence in factories and boardrooms across the country. Business will back you across Europe to help you get there. A similar message from the Institute of Directors. Again, congratulations for Mr Johnson, but it says very clearly a no-deal Brexit would only add to the uncertainty that the country is facing and distract from the challenges of infrastructure upgrades, high costs and things like that the businesses are facing. But avoiding a disorderly exit, it says, will enable the country to focus on them. And then the British Chambers of Commerce as well says the message to Boris Johnson from business communities across the UK couldn't be simpler. The time for campaigning is over and we need you to get down to business. Tell us what your government will do to avoid a messy, disorderly Brexit on the 31st of October. So on the face of it, very friendly, very positive, in the same style, if you like, that Mr Johnson's speech was earlier, but with a very pointed message as well. What they clearly don't want is a disorderly Brexit of any sort.
Theo, anything particular that they're demanding? I mean, this is, general goodwill, as you say, but anything specific?
Well, yes, some of them are very quickly getting down to basics. If you look at what the Federation for Small Business has to say, for example, it says that Mr Johnson must modernise business rates by extending the 2-year 33% rates discount enjoyed by small retailers. It must assist small businesses struggling with employment costs. You've got all that kind of thing. And a similar message from the British Retail Consortium. Business rates have to be a big focus. So while everybody's been talking about what big picture of Brexit, they want Mr Johnson to get down to the nitty-gritty.
OK, thanks very much indeed. Theo Leggett, our business correspondent. Let's have a look a bit more at the markets, and we can turn to Emma Lou Montgomery, who's an Associate Director, Personal Investment at Fidelity International. Emma, first, let's talk about the pound, because this is the thing that really reacts to the politics of the day. What can we tell from today's behaviour of the pound?
Yeah, well, what's clear yet again is that the pound does not like the idea of a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit, because what's happened is that it's not quite gone down to its 2019 low so far today, but it's been hovering very close. The worry there is, of course, that if there isn't a deal, that's not good for the pound, and so that's obviously. I can't really see any reason why, until we have a definite on Brexit, and basically until October 31st has been and gone, that we'll see any sort of real clarity as to which direction the pound is going to be going in.
And the FTSE, the stock market, is really being driven by the pound, isn't it? I get the impression every time the pound goes low, the market goes up, and it's because the FTSE is so dominated by those international companies which make money in foreign exchange.
It is, exactly. And so for them, the pound going down is actually a good thing. I think overall the market, again, hasn't really massively reacted today. It is seeming to be quite tentative. I think more likely than not, investors are going to be tending to look away from the UK. So you can't expect investors to think there's buying opportunities. But as any contrarian investor will tell you, where others are worried, there's often opportunity. And this could very well turn out to be a time when there's plenty of bargains to be had in the UK market for people who are sort of brave enough.
All right, that's interesting. Supposing I'm a reasonably brave investor, where would you say I should be putting my money at the moment?
Well, potentially UK stock market, because there are bargains to be had there. If you look at the FTSE 100, for instance, if you look at some of the companies there that aren't sort of making their money overseas and therefore aren't so worried about sort of the pound rising at all, they prefer the falling pound. You want to look at maybe some companies there, something that's overlooked, you know, a company that maybe at the moment, or a sector that investors are just not looking at because it's seen as being sort of too UK, too dominated by Brexit worries and everything else that's going on over here at the moment.
OK, Emma Lou Montgomery, thanks very much indeed. We can actually just have a quick glance at the markets. FTSE up 53 points, not a huge amount. And the pound against the dollar, 124.42. As I say, the pound has been had a bad day to start with, but then recovered a little bit. It's really been very undecided, in fact, at the moment. But it is quite near its lows of the last 6 months. And the same against the euro, 111. You're not getting an enormous amount of money if you're going abroad. And some places you'll find you'll be exchanging currency at about parity, i.e. you pay £1, you get €1, even though on the foreign exchange market you'll get a little bit more than that. The Dow at the moment has opened up just 45 points. That's the percentage move.